All right, we're about to get started. Superintendent, is your team all on?
I believe so.
Mary, Charlene, Tammy, David, Nate. Yep, looks like they are. All right, well, I think we should get started since I have to read my starting blurb as ever. All right, so I'm convening this meeting of the City Council's Ways and Means Committee. For the record, my name is Kenzie Bach. I'm the District 8 Councilor and the Chair of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee. This public hearing is being recorded and live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-tv. It will be rebroadcast on Comcast Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and Verizon Channel 1964. This budget review process has been encompassing about 27 hearings over 6 weeks. We're in the final week of the sort of standard first round of budget hearings, and we'll be hearing from BPS this afternoon, specifically on its sort of COVID-19 inflected responses in the summer and the fall and the year ahead. We strongly encourage residents to weigh into this budget process, and you can do that in one of several ways by giving testimony for the record. So one option is to attend a hearing like this. There's a link on the public notice to a Zoom. You can sit and watch the hearing and then testify at the end of the hearing. You can also come to a dedicated public testimony hearing, and we'll actually be having the one focused on BPS this evening at 6 p.m.
Hey, Liz, it's Michael.
So one second. There we go. Okay. Reminder to everyone to keep themselves on mute. Yeah, if you want to testify on the BPS budget and you don't want to have to sit and wait for the conclusion of a particular hearing, if you come at 6 p.m. this evening on Zoom, we'll be jumping straight into public testimony. You can also send your testimony to ccc.wm@boston.gov or go on the City Council's website, boston.gov/council-FY21 budget. And you can submit written testimony, or you can make a video of yourself, a 2-minute video, and submit it that way, and we will append it to one of the hearing videos. There's also going to be a dedicated public testimony hearing at 6 p.m. on Thursday for all other departments besides BPS. So we look forward to hearing from you. And, these are uncertain times, and we are all together trying to figure out what the city's budget needs to look like in order to meet them. So we appreciate your input. Today's hearing is on dockets 0588 to 0590, orders for the FY21 operating budget, including annual appropriations for departmental operations, for the school department, and for other post-employment benefits, OPEB. Dockets 0591 to 0592, orders for capital fund transfer appropriations, and dockets 0593 to 0596, orders for the capital budget, including loan orders and lease purchase agreements. Those together collectively make up the dockets that constitute the FY21 proposed budget from the mayor that the council is currently scrutinizing. A component of that budget, in fact, about a third of it, is the Boston Public Schools budget. And this hearing is with the Boston Public Schools team focused on that budget. This hearing specifically is focused on closing opportunity gaps and dealing with the realities of the context of COVID-19, including the following subtopics. Our response to the outbreak during this spring, plans to support students during summer 2020, key considerations and financial implications of reopening schools in fall 2020, and then long-term financial impacts of COVID-19 and the outlook beyond FY20, so 21. So we will be sort of progressively, I imagine, in the presentation, looking forward further in time, knowing again that we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, but also that our school department has to and is beginning to make plans in reaction to the facts on the ground. So I want to note that I've been joined here by my colleagues, Councillor Ed Flynn, District 2, Councillor Michael Flaherty at large, Councillor Liz Breeden, District 9, Councillor Kim Janey, District 7 and Council President, Councillor Anissa Sabi George at large, Councillor Julia Mejia at large, Councillor Matt O'Malley, District 6, and Councillor Andrea Campbell, District 4. So thank you to all of them. And without further ado, I'll pass it off to Superintendent Dr. Brenda Caselius and her team.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, counselors, for being on the hearing call. And thanks to my staff. I just want to reiterate what you just shared about, this last hearing and just how wonderful it's been to be able to talk about our strategic vision. And I thank you again for your leadership in allowing us to align the budget hearings and the budget questions to our strategic plan. It is a 5-year strategic plan. And so as we begin to unfold this 3-year investment that the mayor has committed, we are, parsing out kind of our effort here, and with a focus on the 33 most underperforming schools, then a focus on our high school redesign, and then addressing all other schools as we begin to align the bill PPS investments with the city, our capital improvement investments, and the investments that the mayor has just committed in terms of the $100 million priority for some of our most struggling schools to get at high quality schools in every single neighborhood. It is really, really important that we are able to move forward with this budget. However, we know that we have also been sidelined a bit by this crisis. We know that the city budget and the state budget is also going to be sidelined by this crisis. We are aware of that. But in the end, we know that this is our children and their futures, and we know that they don't get a do-over, that this is the one time they have to get a great education and an equitable education. And we are going to continue to work to provide that for them, even in the most difficult circumstances. So as we talk today, we will be talking just about some of the initial thinking around how we need to adjust our budget, what we think might be some additional costs for the work moving ahead. As you know, because we've had so many hearings already, our budget has been focused on equity. It has been focused on the kids in schools that need it the most. It has been focused on teacher professional development to reach the needs of all students. And we did have investments also to move to one-to-one with our students already. And also a stronger focus on supporting our families with the family liaisons and our social workers for mental health. And as you all did already, we put in the nurses already. So we are really set up with this budget, and also with the addition of the nurses, the social workers, and the family liaisons to provide a significantly different type of experience for our children in Boston Public Schools. And I'm looking forward to continuing to talk to you about how we might need to adjust it just a little bit because of this pandemic. So I'm going to turn it over to, I think, Mr. Cooter this time around, and look forward to your questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Superintendent. And as I pull this up, I just want to say good afternoon again to our city councilors and to the Boston schools community and to the Boston community at large. Thank you for joining us at this hearing this afternoon. I want to mention that we're also being joined by David Bloom, the Deputy Chief Financial Officer, and Tammy Poost, the Special Advisor to the Superintendent, and who's been our point person on our COVID response. Given the council and the public's interest and concerns surrounding the impact of COVID-19 on BPS finances and operations, and most importantly on students, we're focusing this hearing solely on the topic of how the pandemic has affected BPS. And as Councillor Bach mentioned, this is an opportunity to discuss the changes in 4 different time periods: how we've responded to the outbreak of COVID-19 this spring, how we're planning to support students throughout the summer, what the fall will look like and our major considerations going into the fall, and then what are the long-term financial impacts that we are dealing with. We started our budget process rooted in a statement from the Opportunity Achievement Gap policy because our work is focused on closing achievement gaps and closing opportunity gaps that are persistent in the most rigorous and robust educational opportunities. And we think that this is necessary for closing persistent achievement gaps. That focus has not changed during this period of disruption and uncertainty. We believe it is more important than ever. And I want to take this opportunity to thank our many dedicated teachers, paraprofessionals, school-based staff, and school leaders. They have created new and innovative ways to educate our students. They have knocked down barriers and found new ways to support students and families. They have worked tirelessly to do what it takes to ensure our students don't fall behind. There is no better demonstration of an unwavering focus on closing opportunity gaps than what we have seen in the Boston Public Schools. As we rolled out the strategic plan this spring and thought about our response to equity and COVID, we added priorities to each of the commitments to include something specifically and explicitly addressing COVID. However, that review also showed us that our commitments and priorities are more relevant during COVID, not less. Why we need to think different? We need to think differently about delivery. We don't need to think differently about our values. We need to revisit our assessment of how we meet student needs, but we do not need to revisit our assessment of those needs. And instead of changing strategy, COVID has added even more urgency to our work. And our challenge is increasing the pace of change. As I mentioned at the start, this will cover 4 different planning periods. Phase 0, which is about adapting, adjusting, and acting on best practices, covers the closure in mid-March through the end of this school year. The second phase, which is referred to as return, refocus, and reality check, has to do with our summer learning and fall planning for multiple scenarios. Phase 2 is back to school and forward into the future, where we'll think about reopening and all the adjustments that we need to make to our operations and practices. And then finally, the third phase is long-term outlook, what happens after SY next school year and beyond. And we're trying to forecast the financial and educational impacts with an unprecedented level of uncertainty. I think our team's response to the shutdown should be a point of pride that has been it has been a model for other districts. While it has taken the whole district, I want to highlight the work of 4 teams in particular. Our academics team, which has generated culturally and linguistically sustaining content in print and online. It's become a national model that's been tweeted out and shared with other districts. And it has really changed the way that we're working to support schools and with teachers. Our technology team has responded by delivering more than 31,000 Chromebooks and ensuring internet access for all students, regardless of income and immigration status. Our student support team, the counselors and psychologists, have created new standards for student counseling, ensuring our most vulnerable students continue to receive mental health supports. And finally, as you have all discussed in prior hearings, our food nutrition services team established 16 food sites. Over 600,000 meals have been served through this, and 200,000 deliveries door to door. It has been truly impressive. And again, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this really has been a district-wide effort, but we wanted to call out just some of the teams that have been most significantly impacted and have had to alter operations so rapidly this spring. This spring, our goal overall was to think about how do we create flexibility for our district. The first thing we were trying to do was to support students, make sure they have access to technology and can get online. The second was to support our employees and ensure that our employees were held harmless or whole during this period and make sure that we continue to pay everyone. The third was then to create financial flexibility going out of FY20 and into the summer. We knew immediately that we were going to need to expand summer learning, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but that was going to require us to identify potential offsets. And then whenever we could, to create more flexibilities for next fall. The areas highlighted on this slide show where we have had to increase costs. And I want to highlight just a few of them. The first is the $5.5 million to offset lost external funding revenue. As I mentioned, we've really worked to support our employees. There are 2 main sources of lost external funds. The first was decrease in the federal meals program to pay all our food service workers, many part-time and cafeteria managers. And the second was after-school programs, where we have many part-time employees whose programs are paid by parent fees. Those parent fees are no longer being collected. And so this is a place where the district has had to increase our spending and on items that were unbudgeted. We have also worked to identify some offsetting savings from shutting down schools in transportation, as I mentioned this morning, diesel and bus maintenance. We're also looking at our utilities, but we have no reported change in utilities as we monitor the cost this spring. And The other thing that we did was we had to put a stop on spending at the school level because of deliveries and the safety around deliveries in our school buildings. And so we will use some of that flexibility that we created financially, again, to support our summer learning. We know that summer's a critical time, and our summer and remote learning team is planning to support even more students this summer. It's led by our Chief Academic Officer, Andrea Zayas, and Jan Manfredi, who has done summer learning for many years. It includes a number of successful models for the summer. Former programs, the fifth quarter learning, extended school year, which we mentioned this morning, is about special education services over the summer. The English Learner Summer programs, the Important Exam School Initiative, our early childhood team works to develop summer programs as well. We're going to be combining and looking across and leveraging all of those, really about making sure we have effective programs that meet the tailored needs of individual students, thinking creatively and differently about how we can support them over the summer, which is a critical time for learning loss in a typical year, and it's going to be an important time for academic recovery this year in particular. We're also looking for extended opportunities to provide professional development for teachers, model classrooms to be able to explain or explore different practices and improve practices across the district, knowing that we're going to need to carry that flexibility and understanding of how to support students differently into the fall. Food sites and food delivery will continue all summer, and we will have a plan for supporting our students with food and meal programs in the fall. We're also working on cleaning and facility preparation. Many projects, including bathrooms and clean water access, are being accelerated over the summer for us to be able to prepare for the next school year. That includes sanitation and maintenance upgrades. And from a staffing perspective, we expect normal staffing levels plus. I mentioned that we're planning to expand our programs, and we will likely have more teachers, more custodians, and more facility support working over the summer to prepare for our students. Over this phase, there's been an increased focus on engagement of our stakeholders. It's important to note that a lot of what we do in this phase will be guided by public health requirements and recommendations, and with the support from public health crisis management experts. This will mean that our engagement will include a lot of information sharing and, where possible, requests for input where we have options. We will likely have a few online sessions. The superintendent meets quarterly with the citywide parent council, the District English Learner Advisory Council, and the Special Education Parent Advisory Council collectively, and we will use this as an opportunity for input. There are also other existing structures, including our equity roundtables, which the superintendent has highlighted, our Community Engagement Advisory Council that can be leveraged. And finally, we'll be looking at the potential to convene families through Parent University. Moving on to phase 2, which is the back to school, we recognize that these are really unprecedented times, and they call for unprecedented leadership. The leadership of BPS have been working tirelessly to both provide the highest quality remote learning, both throughout the summer and the fall. We can't tell you exactly what school will look like in the fall. We can tell you that all of our planning decisions are being guided by 3 values: the health and safety of our students and staff, educational practices, and our operational realities in the Boston Public Schools. The very highest value is that we are keeping front and center in our planning is the work for the health and safety of all BPS students and BPS staff. We will meet all the CDC guidelines for school districts, including the following. We will all be wearing masks. We will avoid crowding and bunching of kids by putting protocols and practice in place to respect social distancing in our buses, in our hallways, and in our classrooms. We will focus on the very important task that all of us can do to prevent infection, and that is hand washing. We will teach it, we will model it, and we will expect it from our students and from our staff. We look forward to working with our BPS families to make sure they too understand that this is the very most effective way to keep our children and ourselves safe and healthy. We will also be providing the very highest quality instruction possible for all our BPS learners, including our general education, special education, and English language learners. Our academics team is working with our BPS teachers to provide them during the summer with resources and expertise in remote learning. All teachers have been provided PD on this topic and will have the opportunity for more professional development to continue to learn how they can do good teaching online and in the classroom. Third, we will take our commitment to protecting the health and safety of our students and to add to the teachers' staff's expertise in the educational practices. And those knock up against the operational realities within which we are able to do our work. Again, I can't tell you what decisions will be made about how will school look in the fall, but I can tell you that the focus on our planning evolves. We are providing families with healthy screening checklists so they know when it is and isn't safe to send their children to school. Reviewing the size and layout of our classrooms to be able to ensure social distancing. Improving the sanitation and reliability of our bus transportation services. Continue to provide healthy school meals for our students. Putting in place more regular and deeper cleaning protocols in our buildings to prevent the spread of disease. And increasing the availability of our nursing and behavioral health staff so that they can be sure that every student in every building remains healthy and, just as importantly, gets what they need to deal with the stress and chaos that this pandemic is causing all around them. Through all of our planning, we are engaging with the communities we serve and including the voices of teachers, school leaders, students, and families. We are announcing a series of community forums and stakeholder engagement sessions this week, and we look forward to sharing the results of these planning processes with you as they evolve over the next few weeks. I want to revisit a chart that we've been talking about in terms of the overall commitment to BPS over the next 3 years. BPS is heartened that the city is mitigating the cuts in FY21, knowing that other departments in the city and other cities across the Commonwealth are experiencing cuts. I have the opportunity to engage with the Council of Great City Schools Chief Financial Officers Network, and I can tell you that their job is much more difficult than mine because the city is maintaining the $80 million commitment, 7% increase, when most other districts in the state and across the country are facing significant cuts. And you don't have to go that far out of Boston. The mayor of Newton announced significant changes to their budgets and cuts to their schools as well. So we're visiting what our needs are and how COVID will impact the decisions around transportation and student enrollment. And we need you to continue your advocacy to keep the pressure on the state and federal governments to bring resources back to the district, because the city can't sustain long-term funding for BPS with any significant cuts to state aid. We mentioned before in prior hearings that there are two sources of additional funding currently available from the federal government. The first is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, their reimbursement for a limited range of expenses directly related to COVID. And finally, the CARES Act, the federal stimulus funding that has come through. We continue to monitor the state's maintenance of effort waiver to get signals if they intend to reduce any of the funding sources to BPS and to the city, either through Chapter 70 or other grants that are administered by the state. Can't emphasize enough how critical it is for your advocacy in this area and for us to continue to advocate for additional and to maintain funding at the state level. We also need to make progress on major levels that promote financial health. And the difficulty we have is how do we engage on major shifts, including Build BPS, and think about our overall district footprint in this context. We need to continue to think about reforming the central office. We've talked this morning about food operations and transportation, among the other options and operations in the district, to continue to find ways to leverage our resources better and to save money. We also need to continue to make progress on the investments that will close achievement and opportunity and gaps. Those things that we know were important before COVID and they will be important after COVID. We need to be thinking critically about high school redesign, and there will be an upcoming presentation to the school committee on our plans in that area. We need continued investment in social workers, instructional facilitators. We need to continue to expand opportunities, many of which were raised by the city councilors this morning and I know are critical issues. With that, I will turn it back over to Councilor Bach for questions, and I appreciate your time this morning.
Great. Thank you so much, Nate and Superintendent. We'll jump straight into questions, as has been our pattern. We'll go first to Councillor Flynn, and then it'll be Councillor Flaherty. I'll put the order in the chat for councillors. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Councillor Bock, and thank you, Superintendent, and your team for being here today. Some of the questions I was going to ask were answered by Nate already, but I'll just highlight some of the comments I had that Nate also focused on, is not going into austerity mode during this period, making sure that the CARES Act or other federal stimulus, reach our schools and reach our teachers. Also, I know it's important to focus on data, but we don't want to overload our teachers as well by always documenting or always doing data entry. We want to make sure that the teachers have the time to do the teaching and engaging the students in the classroom. Those are three brief comments, but Superintendent, I just wanted to ask one question. The students haven't, going into August, the students really haven't been into a physical class in 6 months. What can we do to ensure that if they had prior mental health counseling available through the school or in the community, what outreach are we doing to those students and their parents to make sure that although they may have missed a lot of those appointments, we get them back on track in terms of mental health counseling going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Flynn, for your concern for students and their mental health. We are really concerned about that as well. And we know that going back to school is going to be a really different type of situation for us this time around, because students didn't get to have closure with their teachers. They often feel disconnected now. And, we want to reconnect with them, build a new sense of community, have joyful learning environments for them that are colorful and bright. So there's a lot that we're going to be doing on our capital side to really try to brighten up our entrances and our buildings and make sure our classrooms are clean, obviously. And also then how do we interact with students in a time when we have to social distance. A number of our students were experiencing some mental health issues before, and they're continuing to have services now. We have had over 1,000, I think it might even be over and close to 2,000 now, telemental health sessions with students, and several thousand touch points with students. And so our mental health team has just been reaching out. We also put in place a student support team process, and we are providing tier 2 and tier 3 supports to students, either touch point with a social worker or a psychologist or outside community mental health provider to be able to help students. And then we have a crisis helpline as well that students can call and get help from if they need it, and we will provide services. So this is top of mind for us, and our team has really rallied around supporting our youth, and we are also thinking about this in terms of our return.
Thank you, Superintendent. And my final question or comment, similar to that question and answer, Superintendent, but for students that haven't engaged in any physical fitness activity over the last 5 or 6 months, then going into school and then social distancing, what programs are you looking at in terms of physical fitness and getting some exercise for the students?
Yeah, I'm really proud of our athletics team who, I know that in our last hearing, they talked to, Councillor George talked a little bit about the fact that some of our teams are missing out on their sports this summer. And that's just heartbreaking that they're missing out on their baseball and other sports that they got to play. So our athletic team and coaches have gotten together, and they've been producing videos on both fitness and nutrition. I even have my own little Instagram account where I've been demonstrating some fitness and nutrition tips for our students and trying to connect that way and doing some innovation. And I think this work that they're doing is actually going to set a model for us as we move to adopting the mass core in our high schools and develop new and innovative ways to offer physical education remotely, because we just don't have enough gym space for students to take PE and meet the mass core requirements. And so we are really looking at this as a model for how we're going to be moving forward as well.
Thank you, Superintendent, and thank you, Council Bach.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Flynn. Next up is Councillor Flaherty, and then it'll be Councillor Braden. Councillor Flaherty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to ask the question I think everyone's wondering right now is, does Councilor O'Malley have a hammock in that beautiful, pristine, peaceful backdrop of his?
Madam Chair, through you to the questioner, I do not. I am on the back deck, and you're seeing some beautiful trees of Ward 20, Precinct 6, a neighborhood I know you know well. And when we're able to socially distance a little less, you're all welcome over for a barbecue. I look forward to that day, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Very good. Very good. Very relaxing. I get airplanes in my background, but that looks very peaceful. Thank you, Madam Chair. And to the Superintendent, obviously it's great to hear. Nate had mentioned that obviously the food distribution is going to continue into the summer. I'd be remiss if we did not give a shout out to Director Benavidez and her entire team for the great work that they've been doing. They're working extremely hard to provide meals to students during this pandemic. And I guess a question there is, I guess the participation numbers, I would assume, would be a little off from what we're used to during the school year. And what, if any, consequences would that be for meal reimbursement that we get from USDA? Also, on that same note, I know we used to have a program with Project Bread, and I know that we were able to save some money because it had reduced some of the administration costs around our participation in that meals program. And it was meals were served based on, I think it was called the community eligibility provision, which allowed food distribution in high need schools. Hopefully that's continuing. And if it is, I'm not quite sure what that is going to save us. And then those are the sort of the two on the food and nutrition side. And then I wanted to sort of dive in a little deeper on the school athletics and what this sort of the COVID-19 means for our students with respect to student athletes. For some, it's the difference between going to school or not going to school. For some, it's the difference between graduating and not graduating. And for some, it's an opportunity at a college scholarship. So hopefully we are providing some hope for our students with respect to fall sports in winter sports, and that our coaches are doing the best they can to sort of stay in touch with their student athletes. And we have a lot of kids, particularly juniors going into their senior year, that are not going to be able to do these college visits, particularly our student athletes. Going to put them at a tremendous disadvantage with other school districts. So I hope this is on the forefront, that if we have a great student athlete that has real potential, that somehow, some way we're engaging these colleges early, whether they're virtual school visits, whether we get video of these kids, again, social distancing, but practicing pitching, hurling, whatever their sport is. But I want to make sure that stays in the mix here. And again, I just know from firsthand experience, it was really the difference between staying in school and not, or producing. Some coaches stay on you to make sure that you're getting a certain grade point average. Some students, have a little additional pressure on them to make sure that they're getting to class in order to play. It's all part of school experience. So Council Flynn touched on it. I wanted to kind of dial in a little deeper on our athletic programs and what we're doing to prepare our student athletes for the fall and winter, and then obviously eventually spring seasons coming up, because we just saw the spring season just got canceled for a lot of kids, and what that means in terms of college opportunity. So that's it for me, and I'll sit and listen. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Superintendent.
Yeah, thank you, Counselor, for that. And just in terms of our meals, we continue to see increases in our meal delivery and also our meal availability at the distribution sites. We were open yesterday on a holiday even for our families. And so they've just done such a great job. I think we had a high point last Friday with our meals served. And so just super, super proud. I think as this COVID pandemic continues on, we see more and more families losing access to food. And I think that that is a troubling sign, but the federal government has lessened their restrictions on serving children and families. We're using our summer feeding model of those meals. And so there's a greater flexibility in who we feed and how we count that. So we don't anticipate a huge amount of losses from that because of the flexibility, at least for reimbursements. So because of the flexibilities. So I think some of the CARES Act may help with some of that as well. So then in terms of athletics, this is a much more difficult piece for us because so many of our sports are contact sports or require that you have more than 10 people in a locker room or around. So we are at the mercy of really the restrictions right now in terms of the athletic teams and what's being done. But our coaches and our athletic director are really thinking deeply about what other opportunities can we create to keep kids in shape and keep them, connected and hopeful about their futures. So it's heartbreaking.
Very good. And then just lastly, Nate, I know you were very optimistic, obviously, about our school buses and students and keeping them distance and what have you. Not sure whether or not that goes into the overall sort of occupancy of a vehicle, but happy to, I know I have my CDL, but happy to do maybe an undercover boss with you and or the superintendent. Sometimes that bus ride can be a little chaotic with kids bouncing around and from seat to seat. And so I want to make sure that whatever best efforts we're putting forward takes that into consideration, that particularly our younger students are so tough to sit still, and we don't have seat belts unless we're going to consider bus monitors. I think that one's going to be tough to police, but it's important because once we get back to school and if kids are going to be riding together, that they need to adhere to the social distancing piece, or at least to the best of our ability, make sure we're doing our part to make sure that we don't have this thing come back to us and impact our students. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Flaherty. Next up is Councillor Braden, then Councillor Janey. Councillor Braden.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Bach. Thank you, everyone. Back to our special needs students. Students with physical disabilities under normal circumstances would be followed by their physiatrist, and they'd be getting equipment, going to equipment clinics, and their physical therapists and OTs would be keeping an eye on their needs. So we're being out for 6 months by the time they get back to school. I'm just wondering in terms of, there's going to be a lot of catch up in terms of mobility equipment needs and letters of medical necessity and all that. I don't know if that's been budgeted for extra time for that.
Yeah, absolutely. We understand that there are going to be additional compensatory requirements for us to provide services to our students for time lost this past spring.
And then just out of interest, I wonder how it's going with the distance learning for our special needs students at this up until now at this point in time.
It's hit and miss, right? So it's based on the student's IEP to the best that we're able to meet their needs. So some students who have less need for one-to-one or face-to-face interactions, and in person for them to be able to progress. That's been challenging, obviously, with the social distancing. And so we haven't been able to provide as much of that support as we would have liked. However, students who have learning disabilities, they can get the services from their classroom teacher or their resource room supports through their classroom teacher from paraprofessionals.
I'm also just curious about the out-of-district student placements. Are the placements, the schools that those students are placed in, are they following up and providing distance support as well as in this time?
Yes, we are trying to do as much as we possibly can with our OT, PT, through telehealth or our other related services as much as possible, through the virtual realm as much as we can.
Okay, that's all I have for
And
now.
that's really dependent on the family and whether the family, is able to help assist with some of that as well.
Yeah.
Some of our students are just not able to do that themselves, and they need to have additional adult help to be able to provide for some of the conditions within their IEP.
Yeah, I understand that. Okay, thank you. That's all I have for now.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Braden. Councillor Janey, and then it'll be Councillor Asabi George. President Janey?
Thank you so much. And thank you again to the team. Very important conversation. Would love to follow up some of the questions that Councilor Braden had on special education. Do you have a sense of how many students we're talking about? What percentage of students in terms of who are continuing with getting their services through their IEP? And then I would have a very similar question for EL students in terms of whatever supports that they were getting that may not be coming across with the general classroom setting in their online learning. Do we have those numbers?
Yeah, President Janey, we can get that for you. We are right now assessing with our student support team and the success plans, as well as students with IEPs, and taking a deep dive into that so that we can get prepared for summer school and identifying those students. So we'll have that. We don't have it completed yet.
And I wonder, because a lot of what we're discussing is really looking forward in terms of planning for FY21. As restrictions are loosened, what plans are in place to try to increase? I'm expecting to see, we don't, to be honest, we have children who are not getting their needs met through their IEP long before COVID came. In terms of really honoring the spirit of that IEP and getting students what they need. But I know, everyone is working hard, especially during this pandemic. And as restrictions are loosened, I wonder if there's any thought to how we might begin to provide more of those services, those that we weren't able to do through an online classroom or remote classroom setting. Is there any thinking about how we might phase back into?
Yeah, we have thought about that. It is a consideration on the table. We just want to make sure that we're putting the safety of our children first. Some of our children are obviously medically fragile and have underlying conditions. So we have to really look at that on a case-to-case basis and what we're able to open up for, once some of these restrictions are lifted.
Absolutely, absolutely, indeed. I appreciate that. Could you also just speak to what the expectations are? So what are we expecting of our young people since March 17th? What are we expecting of our educators? I know this has been very difficult, not just for the students or for our teachers, but certainly for parents. Many of our parents who are essential workers who have still had to work outside of the home, others who are working in the home while their children are also trying to go to school in the home. So I know this has been really difficult. What are the expectations though for our students and for our educators?
So let me start with the educators. You know that we have a MOU with them. So they're expected to teach 3 hours a day synchronously, meaning interaction with a live human being somehow. And then 1 hour of asynchronously, which could be making a video or doing professional development or grading papers or that sort of thing. So that's the minimum expectations. Much of our teachers are doing above and beyond, way more than that, because they are also taking care of the social emotional needs of their children, as well as the housing needs and food security needs. I mean, they're delivering things to the family, they're problem solving for families, they're trying to help them stay connected. They've all turned into actually miniature deputized social workers, quite honestly.
I wouldn't say that they turned into teachers, unfortunately, have had to step into these roles pre-COVID-19 and have done, lots and lots of work to provide for our young people. And grateful that they have done that. And so it sounds like that's continuing during the pandemic. So
it's
safe
more
to
intensified.
Safe to assume that in addition to those 4 hours that is required in the MOU, that teachers are going above and beyond that.
Yeah,
in their time.
and
Can you speak
and-
to, I'm sorry, Sue.
could I also speak to just the learning needs as well? I mean, there's the social emotional needs that they do, but we're also really bringing our teachers up to speed because so many of our teachers, we weren't a one-to-one district. So they also are expected to take professional development, to learn from their colleagues, to continue to try and innovate and learn in this new platform, and to find content and deliver that, and then to follow up with kids who are not engaged in their learning or aren't learning.
I have a few more questions on like the day-to-day learning, and then I'd be really interested in what time teachers have for planning or support or collaboration with each other. So that's obviously a thing that is missing when you're not in a building together, to be able to just kind of sit in the coffee room and kind of have that shared planning time and all of that. So I'd be interested in when those opportunities are happening. But could you speak to what the expectation is in terms of online? So I'm hearing like, and then what are the pros and cons of different platforms? So I'm hearing some are using Zoom, that's very popular, like we're using Zoom now. I'm hearing they're being asked to use Clever. What is Clever? What are the pros and cons of Zoom? What are the pros and cons of Clever? What I'm hearing some are using Google Classroom. What are the pros and cons of Google Classroom? Could you just kind of speak to who's using what the pros and cons of each, etc. And then I would be interested in the planning and support and the collaboration in addition to the adult child, teaching time that we're talking about now.
I'll try to be brief. So Zoom is a platform that we're using right now. I think this is Zoom where you have multiple people in a room where you can deliver content to everyone. And then what I see happening is then there's also breakout rooms where kids can go and have collaboration sessions and study sessions with each other. Clever is, and we're not capturing all of the Zoom data as yet, and teachers are able to use it. So we've just now gotten a new data system when we're trying to get all of those applications, learning applications, and video conferencing applications and phone calls into our data system. That then will give us a better accurate picture of how many students are actually online and engaged in virtual and remote learning. Then Clever is where all those applications go into. It's like a place. It's like a storage place for all of the different applications and websites that students would visit in terms of their learning and what's going on with their projects and assignments. And so, you can imagine a teacher might assign a website, a wiki page, and do research for something. We weren't capturing that prior to COVID. Now we have to put all of that, have teachers put that into the Clever backpack, so to speak, so that we can capture it in our data system. Second, then there's another application called Google Classroom. That's where you go in with all the Google applications. So Google Gmail, Google Chat, and we capture that. So at the higher grades, they used Google Classroom, and at the lower grades, they're using Clever quite a bit more. And so, different grade levels, different teachers choose to use different applications and different learning tools. And so we're trying to capture all of that now. And you can imagine with 4,500 teachers who are getting new applications all the time to try, it's quite a task to try to get all of that into the child's digital backpack so that we can measure it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll save my follow-up for the next round.
Great. Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate that. Next up is Councillor Asabi George, and then it'll be Councillor Mejia, then Councillor O'Malley. Councillor Asabi George.
Thank you again, Madam Chair and Superintendent and your team. I want to just continue some of the conversation that was started in the earlier hearing and then this afternoon on the spring athletics in particular. And we spoke in the earlier hearing about keeping as many school personnel on payroll and continuing to pay them as possible. The bus drivers are one of those examples. Our spring coaches had started the season, and many of them have continued different activities and engagement with their student athletes, but they haven't continued to be paid their spring stipend, which isn't a great deal of money. I'm just curious about the decision to not pay or not fully pay spring coaches And what are our plans for fall athletics? Because again, my boys are looking forward to that fall season, as I know many students are across the district, and curious about the planning that is going into the fall sports, and then also what precautions we are working on with either CDC guidance or state DPH guidance. And then obviously my hope is that it's done in collaboration with those coaches. So spring coaches and payment, planning for fall sports, and any changes that may be happening, and any collaboration that's happening with those coaches.
Per our agreement with the Boston Teachers Union, we paid coaches for 1/6 of their salary for work that had already been done. They are not currently being paid for work that is, we just weren't able to host sports this season. And we are working with the MIAA as well as CDC guidelines and state guidelines around what's going to be actually possible for fall sports. So we don't have an answer quite yet on that, and we're waiting for state guidance on what that's going to look like.
My hope is that when I coached softball, and so I've got a lot of relationships within the spring coaches community, and have been engaged in some of that online work to keep our kids motivated and engaged, our student athletes in particular. So just I hope that they're at the table, because I know that they have a lot of insight into our children and sort of their needs, because they do have ongoing relationships with those kids, and will have relationships for the fall season. So as much as you can include them in that would be great. I also think, just from Counselor Flynn brought up physical education, and just knowing, again, judging my own children's behavior, and their, we want to keep them at home, or trying to keep them at home, which makes being physically active a little bit more difficult. I wonder if there is an opportunity through summer school, non-traditional summer school, or some sort of student engagement, if there could be an opportunity perhaps to engage kids in some more physical activity and outdoor physical activity as things start to open up, as our parks start to open up. I think that's a way too to maybe engage some of our coaches and thinking about planning for a fall season. We talked about it in this morning's hearing as well, around school safety, and specifically to preparing our buildings, both cosmetically, so making sure that they're getting the spring cleanings, whether it's the lawn mowing. I was by a school yesterday that hadn't been well maintained from the outside. It appears to not be well maintained from the outside. But making sure that spring cleaning is happening, the deeper cleans are happening, and how will we make sure that the deeper cleans are happening in the new school year, and what are those protocols that will be in place, obviously, again, with CDC, DPH guidelines.
Yeah, prior to COVID, we were in the process of doing actually joyful school audits to look at outdoors, outdoor landscaping, indoor lighting, indoor colorful hallways and school classrooms, and just checking all of that. And so we were just about finished with that auditing. And so we'll use that as a guide as we begin to look at summer cleaning and summer capital improvements. As Nate said earlier, some of that is going to be ramped up, like with our bathrooms and our hand washing, because we know that our buildings are going to have to be much cleaner than what they were before this, in order to keep our kids safe. So it is top of mind. It's part of our reopening plans, and we're going to know, because we're going to hold ourselves accountable for it. Again, we did add 25 new custodial positions, so that now you'll have night custodian positions as well as day custodian positions. And we think this is also going to help with creating safer and healthier school communities for our children and our staff.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Caselius and team. That's it for me. At least this round, I'll review my notes. Chair Bach.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Sabi George. Next up, Councillor Mejia, then it'll be Councillor O'Malley and Councillor Campbell. Councillor Mejia?
Yes, thank you, Chairwoman Bach and Superintendent Casilius and your team. I feel like this is like, we spend 24 hours a day together with these long sessions. So thank you for bearing with us. I just have a few questions about the survey that went out on April the 3rd. about learning from at-home experience. And one question asked about food insecurity. I'm just curious about what percentage of respondents answered that they had enough food and how many stated that they needed more. I'm not sure if you have information around that. I'm also curious
It
to
was
know,
at about 20%, Counselor.
okay, what percentage of households stated that they had stable internet access? Do you know?
That was at about 5% that told us that they still needed internet access. We were actually pretty surprised by that number that indicated that our parents were telling us at least that they had more internet access than what we had actually anticipated. So just 5% saying they still needed help with that.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Question 18 asked how much time a family student is spending on their education every day. Can you provide a breakdown of the respondents to that question? Do you know?
Give me just a second. I don't have that data point, but I will
Are you
have that
looking-
in just a minute.
I
And
have
it was 14% now. It's been an ongoing survey, so we still are getting responses. So at one point it was 20% having food insecurity. I'm glad to see that number has gone down now to 14%. In just a second, I'll have the most up-to-date number on your last question.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit more about your educators focus group? How many have you done to date? Who has been invited to take part in these focus groups, and what kinds of recommendations have you heard from the plans to implement those recommendations?
That's been great. So with educators, I have had 2 so far focus meetings because we've just been on remote learning now since May 4th. And so I wanted to start those when we started having more of a coherent expectation around what we were going to be doing in remote learning in the remote learning plan to see how that was working, because I think this is one big pilot on how we're actually going to be doing it this fall, and how remote learning can work in a blended environment as well. So the first one was a general one with teachers, and our academic office convened that for us, and we got some really great feedback about what was working and what was not working. The second one we held last week was with our ESL and SLIFE teachers, giving us feedback around EL and what was working and not working. Generally, we had, teachers saying how, even though they are disconnected, they feel even more connected because they are continuing to talk to their families like daily. And so this has been giving them more access. We see with our EL teachers saying that they need additional support with multilingual materials.
I'm curious though, what schools were these? Did you have a nice sampling? There's 125 schools. Just curious about who were the teachers that were participating, because I know every school is uniquely different, and so are the needs of those educators. So I'm just curious.
I don't have the list of schools. We can certainly get it for you. We had our academic office work with our BTU partners to give us teachers who are at the elementary level, the high school level, secondary level, so that we got all levels of teachers on that feedback call.
Thank you. And then I'm just curious, during our hearing on food access, during COVID-19, we learned that we do not collect any information on the people who use our meal sites, even their zip code. Moving forward, do we have any plans to learn more about how effective this program has been beyond just the number of meals handed out? For example, if we find out that there are neighborhoods that are not utilizing this service as much, do we have any plans to increase accessibility in those neighborhoods?
Yeah, we do actually have the information on food access by our neighborhood and how many, East Boston is our highest area where we're handing out most of our food and getting the word out there, and families are accessing food there. And then we have other sites that aren't handing out as much food, and we think some of this might be like location of the school facility within the neighborhood and access to it. So we will be reevaluating that in terms of our summer sites, and which ones do we have, or do we have other neighborhoods where we need to move and add additional ones. Remember, now this is BPS and our distribution, but we are also partnering with the city, and the city also has them at their neighborhood centers and across the city as well. So we see this as a joint effort with our city partners and food access for the entire city. We are serving the children though, because that's what we're reimbursed for.
Thank you. And I'm
And
curious.
we are also not just serving Boston Public School students, we're serving any child that comes up.
Thank you. And I'm just curious about, I always talk about students who are chronically absent, and if they were chronically absent before COVID, I'm just curious about what are we seeing, what are we learning, and what are we looking in terms of graduation rates for some of the students who have fallen behind as a result of COVID-19? What's that looking like, and what are we thinking about doing to support these students?
So to get at your earlier question, it was about 2% say that that's none of the day, 15% a little bit of the day, and 9% say almost all of the day. And so that's kind of where we're at with that. And then the remainder is about 74% say that they're learning most of the day. So that was the question you asked earlier. Your last question was about learning and what we're finding out about their learning.
Or those who are chronically absent. And
yeah, so as you know, that's really a school by school. Some of our schools have really good attendance, and then some of our schools, like some of our alternative schools, have struggled with their attendance and chronic absenteeism prior to COVID. And so we see some of those similar patterns happening still during the COVID crisis, where students who didn't engage pre-COVID are still having difficulty engaging now. And what we've done is ask school leaders to work with their school teachers, their social workers, and their student support teams to develop plans. We think that may be why we have a little bit larger percentage of students on student support plans than what we would have typically anticipated we would have.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
We're also using our student attendance officers to help us with looking at students as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll save the rest for my round.
Great. Great. Thanks so much, Councillor Mejia. Next up is Councillor O'Malley, and then it'll be Councillor Campbell and then Councillor Arroyo. Councillor O'Malley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon again, Superintendent Nate and your entire team. Thank you for your just great work during very difficult times. A couple of questions I want to skip around to. The first is to follow up on Councillor Sabi George's question about the spring coaches. You had mentioned that there was an agreement made to obviously pay for them for their work. I know that with substitute teachers, we were paying at a prior rate. Is that continuing through the end of the school year?
Yes, we are continuing all of the agreements through the end of the school year. That includes the substitutes, the per diem subs.
Great, thank you for that, and I appreciate that. And then in terms of the, provided we get to the point which we will be at in about a month from now and voting on our budget and it goes through and the allocations there for the hub schools and the additional supports, the parent engagement counselors and the social workers, will their start date be the first day of school or the new fiscal year, July 1?
Well, I think everybody's start date is July 1, right, Nate? Or is there a different start date for family liaisons and some of the other positions?
Yeah, the BTU contract doesn't actually start until the first payroll. That it's later in August that's their start date for their contract year. It does run a little bit different from the fiscal year in terms of the dates for the managerial, the family liaisons or managerial. And we've begun hiring for those. Those positions will be active as of July 1st. So it depends on whether it's a BTU or basis position or whether it's
sure. No, understood. I guess suffice it to say that to do some of the community outreach and the family outreach that's so desperately needed through the summer, there will be added bodies on staff to sort of help facilitate. I mean, it'll be a baptism by fire for sure. They'll have individuals who won't necessarily have interacted with the students one-on-one, but at least they'll be able to help support the family engagement piece, which I know is so crucial. So
if
I know
we
that
are able to hire them earlier, we could still offer though that they participate in professional development with our team, especially in those 33 transformational schools who will be doing a lot of professional development this summer.
So could you hire them before the budget's passed, or is it contingent on the funding in the budget?
I don't know if we could hire them before the budget is actually passed, but we are certainly interviewing and getting folks in the pipeline ready to go assuming the budget will pass.
Sure. Yeah, and I was just more curious. I guess the sooner we could get them to start, the help bolster some of the extra work that's been added on for you and your team in the
Right.
the BPS.
But if people know they're going to be hired and we tell them what their start date is, we can still offer them to come on board
Sure.
and participate in the professional development.
Sure. And coming from a family of Boston Public School teachers, I know that they will. I am certain that the new hirees would be more than amenable to starting early, just to help address the mammoth challenges ahead. So I think both Nate, you and Soup have sort of talked about, we're not quite sure what the fall looks like. I don't think anybody is, to be honest with you. I don't think any system is. I know some systems have been more bullish on prospects than others. And obviously you can't answer this question because we don't know, so many things can change, or watching so many things. But do you have any sort of dates in time or sort of benchmarks where you're gonna make a decision on what the school year will look like? Or is it more we're going to come up with a bunch of different contingency plans and see which ones need? I mean, I guess can you briefly just sort of talk about what the thought process is, realizing it's such a mammoth undertaking? It's sort of, you know, but here again, we are 3 or 4 months away from when the new school year would start. So what is going into sort of the conversations and the decision making in terms of what the September is going to look like in the BPS?
Yeah, well, there's four major buckets, and then there's the budget bucket that, you know, we're all talking about right now.
Yeah.
But the biggest major bucket is really around enrollment, registration, and assignment, and getting kids registered and enrolled and assigned, right? That's a huge, big piece. The second is the health and safety of our students, and really all of the provisions that have to go in the health and safety of our students, you know, from PPE ordering and hand sanitizing and social distancing contingencies, and, you know, all within the CDC guidance and the state guidance around group size and what's possible in terms of opening and being in buildings and ventilation systems and all of that. Then we go into the third bucket, which is facilities, and we're looking at our school buildings and how big the classrooms are, and trying to figure out how many kids can fit in a classroom, how many kids can fit in a day, you know, how you would serve food during the school day. And then that then determines student schedules and what days kids go to school, if they go all days, some days, half days, you know, it's just like all of these contingencies that are have to be considered. And then the fourth bucket is really transportation, and how do you get kids to and from school safely, and do that in a way where they can still get there on time. Already in Boston Public Schools, getting kids to school on time is a challenge. But now with COVID, we have a lot of different considerations in terms of how many kids can be on a bus. How do you keep them social distanced? How do you keep them safe? And then how do buses arrive and you know, kids get on and off buses? You know, so those are really the key core areas, and that's all obviously going to be impacted by resources and resource management and personnel management. And so we've developed a framework for timelines, and, you know, we kind of work backwards and say, okay, if school is supposed to start September 10th, what decisions, what timelines have to be met in order to meet the goals of whatever that action step is that we want to do.
Recognizing the fact that even with the best preparation, and I know you are doing everything humanly possible to sort of plan out every contingency, even with the best preparation, which I would put Boston's up against any city in America's, things can change, and there's a lot of unknowns right now that are going to have a supreme impact. So just rest assured, Superintendent, I know I can speak for my colleagues, we absolutely support you in this endeavor. It is incredibly hard, incredibly complicated. Nothing is easy. It really, out of every challenge that COVID-19 has put before us, I think this is one of the most unique and far-reaching and impactful. So we appreciate your good work. My time is nearly up, but I think just the whole idea about facilities, there's going to be a huge cost associated with that. For something as simple as, I'd assume we would want, you know, temporary sinks and soap dispensers in every classroom, for example. Something like that is just going to obviously be very, very expensive. So but we're committed to it and committed to provide a safe and healthy environment for our kids. So thank you all, and I'll obviously follow up with additional questions in the next round.
Well, Counselor, I'm actually surrounded by an incredible team of folks at central office who are highly talented, and we're all thinking through these things together and doing it with the mayor and his folks too at the city, so that we can be aligned, efficient with our resources, and then really protecting our children and their health and safety. Thank you.
Thank you,
Great.
Sue.
Thank you so much. Next up is Councillor Campbell, then it'll be Councillor Arroyo, and then Councillor Edwards. Councillor Campbell. Councillor Campbell. Oh, you know what? She fell off. All right, we're going to jump for now and go to Councillor Arroyo.
Hello, thank you, Chair. Madam Chair. So I might need 2 rounds on this. We do have a hearing scheduled. I think we're looking at June for that hearing, specifically to address sort of what reopening looks like and what the school year 2021 looks like with COVID. But if I could just kind of go back to the slides. We had phase 1, phase 2, and it looks like phase 2 is speaking directly towards the fall. Is that kind of the idea of what phase 2 is? The back to school, forward to the future?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so when I look at that, and I think, is it safe to say that in the thinking behind this, the phase 2, the back to the school, forward to the future, the phase 1 return, refocus, reality check is going to heavily address sort of what that looks like?
Yeah, the idea being that we're assessing how our learning is going to be able to really understand what are the dynamics in play in terms of student learning. We're really spending the summer understanding our operational considerations. As the superintendent mentioned, there are a number of different parallel paths that are all happening around logistics, safety, operations, and cost. And so this summer is really that opportunity to really build those plans out into the fall and to figure out how to build flexibility even within those plans for the fall.
Is there any hard consideration? Is there any one thing that would prevent you from opening schools again? Is there any one thing that has to be checked? One box that would have to be checked in order for you to reopen schools?
Our children have to be able to return and their health and safety be guaranteed. I think that's the hard box that the mayor and I want to be able to check off, and that's going to be reliant on the CDC and the state guidance around reopening and the safety of our students, and really basing that in the science.
And so I guess my point is, if that's the case, if the pandemic is still, if we still don't have a vaccination, if we still don't have some kind of cure for this, if it's still going on in the fall, you foresee a reality in which you could have a safe school reopening?
I do see a reality in which we could have a safe school opening, but we would have to be able to check all those boxes. And the way I understand it now, it's that we're able to test, we're able to see continued declines in the community in terms of new cases and deaths. All of those go into the measures, and then also being able to have all of the other boxes checked around our own health and safety, being able to isolate students, and if they're sick, having our nursing staff on in our buildings. Thank God we already passed that last year, so we'll have that. So there's a number of things that have to be checked for us to be able to open up safely.
So I think my one concern that I'm having right now with that is April 14th, we had a hearing here, you were here. I asked you specifically about reopening and whether or not we could do that if it required social distancing. And your answer was, quote, "I don't think we can safely open schools with social distancing for children. Children cannot be depended upon to socially distance. I just don't know how that would even be possible, quite honestly. I don't see how a teacher could even manage that with 10 kids. I'm not sure it would be socially and emotionally correct for our children to be in that environment. That would not be my recommendation." And so in the span of a little bit over a month, are we now coming along to the thinking that all of that isn't actually the case when it comes to socially distancing in the fall reopen?
Counselor, on April 14th, I didn't realize what is today. And so as this thing evolves, I get more and more evidence, and I get more and more clear on what this virus is, and listening to science and listening to the advisors of the CDC, obviously. And so that will be my guidepost for how we open. I do think for our younger children, and this is what I'm hearing across the nation, it's just much harder for younger children, right? I mean, they'll take their masks off or they'll put it back on. And so we have to really think about what we put in place to be able to assure for ourselves and for our public and for our parents that children will be safe when we return them. That will have to be, I will have to feel 100% confident in that when we send our kids back to school.
I think the reason why I put more stock in what you felt on April 14th, and the reason for that is the CDC, with all due respect, I think these are the correct guidelines that they're trying to put out, but they're not educators. They don't work with third graders and fourth graders and second graders. And they don't recognize whether or not they'd be able to socially distance or keep masks on in close proximity. And I think as an educator in your heart, you do. And I think that those concerns are concerns that I've heard from multiple teachers, multiple parents, the idea that they can't do this social distancing, they can't do these masks. And so as we talk about reopening, my concern is that the reopening is becoming a political decision. The reopening is becoming a decision about what the CDC and what the state guidelines are, because it helps with the reopening of our economy to have schools open rather than the safety of our children. And so from the concerns that I have, it concerns me that when we're talking about even a re-education within a month and a half as to what the safety guidelines are, a month ago you were adamant that children just couldn't follow these guidelines. To be now in a position where CDC or state guidelines could say, well, these are what the guidelines are, to then say, well, children can follow that, I think that's just not going to hold up. And my concern is that instead of focusing on ways we can make remote learning better during a fall semester, when we really can't, if the goal is to not reopen schools until it's safe for all our children, I don't think we can make that commitment. I don't think we can actually say that we can keep all of our children safe when we reopen schools. And if that's actually the goal, then I think our time is better spent trying to figure out how to make remote learning work during the fall semester than it is trying to force them into school and follow these guidelines that don't work. And I recognize that for a number of different educational standpoints, our APs, kids who really need different on-hand learning, remote learning is not cutting it, and that's a real issue. But from a health standpoint, I would hate to see one single child have an issue with this where they have either severe complications or their family have severe complications. And I think in your heart and in my heart, I recognize that even as a high schooler, I probably wouldn't have kept the mask on all the time. I probably wouldn't have stayed away from my friends. And so that's just a reality that I think we have to face. I think it's a hard one, but I don't see a world in which we can actually reopen safely. And I think a month ago, that was essentially where you were on that. And I just want to make sure that as we move forward, we keep track of what's realistic and not what's politic.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, Counselor. And I just want you to know that I'm at the table with the mayor making these really hard decisions, and both of our hearts are at the table, and they're always going to be focused on children and not a political decision. And I've seen that in Marty Walsh and his leadership. And that's what I've come to just really admire about him, that he is putting the health and safety of our community first, as well as I am. So we'll both be at that table, and we'll have to check off a bunch of boxes before I would make the decision and recommend that to the mayor that we reopen. And so my job as superintendent, is to ensure that we are able to do this safely, whether it's 5 kids in a class or 10 kids in a class. I'm thinking on April 14th, a normal class with 25 children in it or 26 children in it, that would not be feasible. But if we were having a much smaller number of children in a classroom, it would be much more feasible for children to be able to do that in social distance. But it would be really challenging for a teacher to do that with 26 kids in a very small classroom. So we're doing all of those preparations now, measuring our classrooms, looking at how many students can safely be in there, and what would be the normal protocols that a teacher and how many adults would it take to be able to do that safely. And so we'll have all of that ready to go before we actually say, yes, we will be reopening.
Okay, and Chair, I see the gavel. I have one direct follow-up that should be short to this direct point.
You're way over, Counselor. So
Then I'll save it for round 2. That's fine. I had it. Thank you.
All right, next up, Counselor Campbell, who had gotten kicked off by the internet, and then Counselor Edwards, and then it'll be Counselor Campbell. Counselor Edwards.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very quick, I see my colleague had gone through the reopening questions, so I'll just stick to, I don't know if these are ideas or suggestions and thoughts about it, and also partnerships that we might consider. One partnership I'm curious if we've thought about and is our universities. They've been helpful in terms of space and dorms for our homeless population, but I'm wondering if they do not come back and they go online or they go to limited resources, they have classroom space as well. And wondering if partnering with them allows for our classes to stretch out, or for some of our older or larger students to be able to use some facilities on our university campuses. So what kind of partnership are we discussing that allows for us to stretch our kids or stretch them further? I also wonder in terms of partnership for socially distances for our little ones, not just on university campuses at daycare, but just looking in general at daycare facilities and wondering how and if universal pre-K can be adjusted in a different way that allows for us to start the pipeline and also socially distance. I'm wondering if there have been any conversations at all, I guess, with universities on how they can be helpful with. They've been useless well, no, they've been not as good when it comes to their pilot payments, but they have facilities, they have space. So I'm curious if BPS has even tried to tap into that.
Yeah, our university partners have reached out to us, especially like tutoring and using some of the counseling staff or pre-service teachers to support us in our work. In terms of facilities, we're looking at that, all options are on the table. So we'd be glad to continue to look at that as a possibility.
I'm lifting that up mostly because they have been pretty bad in terms of their community benefits and their pilot payments towards the city of Boston. I think it's a time for them to rise to the occasion, and it could be guided by BPS specifically because of this particular moment. So I hope that there is a more aggressive conversation with them about the community benefits that they have agreed to provide to the city of Boston to help us in BPS schools. The other thing I was wondering is, I think in the last hearing two budgets ago, we discussed vaccination. And at the time, the vaccination records rate, not the actual kids who got the shots, was like 50% that we had records on kids who had actually gotten vaccinated. So I'm curious, and again, fingers crossed, as a vaccination or some sort of antibody testing or something that puts us in a better informed position, not just in this pandemic, but in general. What are the vaccination rates right now, or vaccination records rates right now? I think the goal was to get it to 80, or actually the goal was 100%, but we were moving pretty fast towards getting that taken care of.
Well, we do require vaccinations upon registration, and so we could certainly get what that percentage is. I think it's better than 50%, but I don't have those percentages right in front of me in terms of the number of students who are vaccinated, but I think we're well above the 50% rate. And then if a new vaccine is given, I'm sure that, it's going to be availability of those vaccines. I just don't know how this,
all sorts of long-term,
I just don't know how the CDC and the state will make those decisions about how those are actually, given out.
Right, but we needed to make sure that we had our records together, and it was as low as 50% in terms of the records, not the kids who got the shots. So I want to make that a distinction. I don't believe that only 50% of the kids in BPS were vaccinated. I think that we made that clear in that hearing. It's just we didn't have records for a lot of them. So that needs to be corrected, and may have well been, but I'm curious where we are on that. And then in terms of our seniors or older students, this seems like a wonderful opportunity. Other high schools, or Charleston High School has been, building a platform and pipeline into local community colleges to basically have them graduate with, I think, a year of college under their belt. I feel like as colleges are moving online and some of our classes are going to stay online, for some of our older kids, the ability for them to learn at home and get college credit, I think that's an infrastructure that we should keep. it allows for them to do social distancing. It allows for us to have fewer kids in school, especially as they get senior, junior level. So, and it doesn't hold them back. It allows them to keep pushing forward. So I'm curious about how we're strengthening the relationship with our local community colleges for kids who are ready and able to start earning college credit, but they can do so from home.
We have a consortium of university partners that our team is working with weekly, and it's also part of our high school redesign to do early college and concurrent enrollment. And so we'll be strengthening those relationships. Next year is a planning year, as you know, for our high school redesign. And so we'll have our higher education partners at the table with us there, as well as we develop our career pathways and stronger early college programs within our high school redesign.
I see my time is up, but if I have any questions after the second round, I will stick around. So thank you very much, and really would like the vaccination records. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Councillor Edwards. Next up now, Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Councillor Bach. And my apologies for falling off. The internet connection went bad for a minute. So many of my questions specifically related to reopening were asked by some other colleagues, including most recently Councillor Arroyo. I also had questions related to our special needs students and English language learners, but for the sake of time, Councillor Janey and other councillors also asked questions. And I think Councillor Janey had specific requests around some information that we could get via sort of numbers of how those students are doing. So I will just add my name to that request. One question I do have is with respect to the reopening conversation. You know, obviously there's some task force forming to make a space for teachers and educators to be able to inform those conversations, which I think is incredible. Curious if there's going to be any other working groups or task force where some students or families or parents might be able to participate with BPS with respect to the reopening conversation in the fall. And also, of course, any planning with respect to the summer. Curious what efforts are being done there to specifically include students, parents, and families.
So I actually have a meeting coming up with the Citywide Parent Council, and we're developing an entire stakeholder engagement process, not as robust as the one we had this fall with strategic planning, but also trying to engage with all of our key stakeholder groups, SPEDPAC, the OAG task force or Yale task force, some of the more official formal ways, but also then, just parents and having them participate. And then we've been participating with our equity roundtable, which has, again, I said over 80 to 120 each week of our partners and key partners and stakeholders. And we've begun to have those conversations with them as well. So that's another way to engage them. And then I meet weekly with the BSAC members in my youth cabinet. And so that's another way. I do think it would be good to have a youth town hall around these ideas as well.
Thank you, Superintendent. That sounds fantastic. And kudos to you for thinking outside of the box with respect to some of the parent site councils, right? And being intentional around how you engage parents that may not show up in that space, but may show up in community-based organizations or other spaces, and of course our young people. So thank you for that. And one other question I have, and I apologize if this came up, Councillor Bach, can just say that came up. Look, listen to the part you missed. There's obviously a lot of talk and conversation, not just in Boston, but across the country on learning loss. Some people call it COVID-19 learning loss, right? What students were already susceptible to learning loss. And then now, of course, all of our students are susceptible to some learning loss because of this. And specifically, students who are our special needs students with IEPs, English language learners, low income students, those students now, right, who are trying to work virtually while also taking care of a younger sibling. I've seen that in some of my virtual classroom settings. It's real. I'm curious from your perspective on just a high level, people are going to try to do more studies on this. Obviously, we still need a lot more, and we need to know more in order for us to before we make conclusions, right, with respect to the learning loss. But based on what you're seeing, based on what you're hearing from your team members, from community, from parents, all of the stakeholders you're engaging with, I'm curious what your perspective is on the learning loss that will happen as a result of COVID-19 for our students, and particularly some that fall into certain categories. What your sort of perspective is on that?
Well, certainly, we had 75% of our students who are high need in Boston, 50% who have home languages other than English, a large undocumented new to country population, as well as 22% of our students with disabilities. So, the challenges and the barriers that some of our children face, both historic and systemically, are great, right? And then this has revealed them even further, and families are really struggling, as we see with our numbers of food distribution going up each week. We know that this is not getting easier, but it's getting harder for families. And as this goes on, we know that the effects are cumulative around the mental health of what it means to be sheltering in and the challenges. That's why I think it's so important to continue to engage our students and try to find ways to do that. And we've done that with our student support teams to figure out for each individual family, because the circumstances are so unique and different for each family. That is really the challenge, and really the only way I've actually seen us be able to close opportunity achievement gaps is one by one, case by case, with the student support team model in my career. And so I'm glad to have put that in place in a more coherent way across the entire district, because it was some schools had really strong processes and some schools didn't have strong processes for that. And now we've built a really strong process for that, as well as our equity roundtables for school leaders to partner with their community and with community-based organizations nearby, so that then they can take a problem of practice and really solve it together. And I think those two pieces are two pieces that are going to continue into the future, that are going to help us identify where this learning loss is happening, and then to continue to support children and their families, not just children, but also their families, and wrap around the community supports to do that, because we cannot do it alone. It's going to take all of us.
Thank you, Superintendent. I see the gavel. I can wait for any pressing questions for the next round. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Superintendent.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Campbell. Now jump to my questions. To start out with, I guess these are sort of budget related and maybe more for Nate, just about, so, I mean, when you pulled up the extra costs for FY20, it seemed like maybe about $7.5 million of those seemed pretty plausible for reimbursement from a FEMA, maybe CARES Act perspective. But some of that, like the lost food and sorry, that's Councillor Campbell's timer. Some of that, the food we had to throw away, the external funds that we dropped, those seem like less good candidates. What's your expectation about how we're going to fill that hole? And then my second question is kind of looking ahead. I mean, Councillor O'Malley alluded to the fact that the kind of adjustments to our school environments that the CDC's guidance is going to entail seem enormously costly. They go well beyond the capital investments that we are planning. Certainly, I think there's a huge question mark vis-a-vis buses. Do you need to be running double trips? What are you paying at? And the potential for like a extremely large delta here is pretty high. So I'm sure that we would first be seeking that money through FEMA, through CARES, et cetera, but presumably to take on a financial liability that could look like, 10% of this district's budget, 20% of the district's budget. I mean, we're starting to get up into really high numbers. I'm just wondering how your team in the budget office are thinking about what we can take on with a reimbursement expectation and how we're going to handle that financially.
Yeah, so at first I would say that a large portion of the Chromebook costs were paid for out of the resiliency fund. So we're very fortunate to be able to do that. We also had a plan in place already for FY21 to move to one-to-one devices 7 through 12. We're exploring rolling that one-to-one out district-wide as a way to deal with that. I should have said up front, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity. We are extremely confident that we're going to be able to close this fiscal year without any additional appropriations, and to create some flexibility for summer school. We did put in place sort of a shutdown of all spending at the school level, and some other offsetting savings from things like utilities or from transportation. You are correct, about $1 million in maintaining health and safety for our frontline workers. Some of that money will be reimbursed, submitted to Fema for reimbursement. And the CARES Act funding is very flexible about whether or not we can use it for FY20 or FY21. So we're trying to figure out how to leverage that in the best way. I think there are so many different scenarios that we're exploring with so many high costs that you're right that when you start to do it on the back of the envelope, it starts to become
enormous.
Yeah, it's hard not to, particularly when we start talking about our transportation budget. I think what we know and what we're exploring are how you can do it in multiple different scenarios, and then figuring out what is the most effective way for ensuring education in our students. And I think what we're talking about is trade-offs that are both relevant, as the superintendent said, not compromising on the health and safety of our students and staff. That's not something to be factored in. That is a sort of a exclusionary factor. Then the second is, what are the trade-offs? What are the benefits of remote versus in-person? What are the different ways to serve kids? How are we thinking about it for basically being able to support families in this? I know as a parent of 2 young kids, when I think about the alternatives and how we maintain our work schedules and online learning, as I think Councilor Wu mentioned this morning in the hearing that she had to make sure one of her kids is logging into Zoom. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of reliance on parents and families. So we want to get feedback on that. And we're just going down basically a number of parallel paths to do a lot of costing out, to come up with a number of scenarios, partnering with other districts, learning from what they've done in other countries, and really rapidly getting up to speed on a number of different options. It's premature for us to really narrow down, because at this point, what we're really trying to do is just understand the different calculations being put in place. And so the superintendent mentioned sort of the 4 critical factors. The reason that we keep talking about transportation is because, well, it's the reason it came up this morning. It's the reason it comes up every year, City Council. We spend a lot of money on transportation. It's very expensive running a full choice district, and having a lot of very small schools that we are transporting kids in many different versions. Even as I heard Councilor Edwards' version of maybe using university space, all I could think of was it's one more place that we're going to be transporting kids. And so, these are all the factors that are swirling around in our team's head. Thankfully, there's a number of people who are much smarter than I am doing the math on the different scenarios. And so, I think we're going to be learning a lot over this summer, and coming up with a lot of creative solutions to this challenge.
Yeah, I guess that's where it concerns me that we have a June 30th deadline mentioned in the morning for signing a transportation contract, just because I can imagine with the parallel processing some pretty radically different transportation solutions, some of which would potentially provide some of the savings we're going to need for an enormous number of other costs.
Yeah, I would just say in terms of transportation and I think there are 2 limiting factors when we think about the flexibility in transportation. The first is the contract with our transportation vendor, Transdev. I think there's a lot of flexibility. The contract was written to be innovative in terms of how they manage their operations back when we first implemented it, now 6 or 7 years ago. The other consideration is collective bargaining. We do have a collective bargaining agreement with our drivers. And so when we go in and we start to consider doing dynamic routing or updating routes throughout the year, that these are factors that really will come into play. And so that's just a third complicating factor on transportation, or another complicating factor on transportation is not just thinking about the vendor contract, but also our collective bargaining agreements with the drivers union.
Yeah.
And I should say, and I should have said this at the start, of course, I thanked a number of people for all their hard work. Our AFSCME union, our collective bargaining partners in the facilities team, really the custodians have done an amazing job, and our bus drivers, the local bus drivers union, they have also been great partners with us. So we are asking people to step up and do more than they've ever done before. And I don't want to make it seem like they are something to overcome, but it's just another factor consider and another group to be working with as we look for more flexible options.
Absolutely. And I guess one of the things I wonder about is as we sort of parallel process here, you know, we do have a lot of important collective bargaining agreements. And I mean, you know, when you go and look at the CDC guidelines that were introduced last week, for instance, right, they suggest really not mixing groups of students. So suddenly, like, you know, you might have schools where the norm is to send rearrange the class groupings, especially in high schools or whatever, where we might actually want to keep them static. And suddenly you're talking about changing your whole scheduling day. And, you know, and if we're asking teachers to split their class and we're staggering times, and therefore you're asking everybody to teach every class twice. I mean, these are enormous changes in our practice with our workers. And so I guess you just brought it up, Nate, but we haven't really talked about the collective bargaining piece of how that goes into the puzzle to make whatever radical shift needs to happen for the fall happen. So can you just explain a little bit about the timing on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's like I said, there are parallel paths to all of these options. What we need to do is understand an option, understand, first of all, its academic impact and the academic viability of it. And then we're in conversations now with all of the different partners to go down these parallel paths. And so it's one of those things where, you know, multiple options are moving down the path and things will start to come together. Obviously for families, for the city, we all need more predictability, but this is just, you know, I think we couldn't commit to any specific timeline right now because, you know, there's so many different factors that we're trying to take into account.
All right. Well, that's all my time. So we'll go back up to the top. Going to Councillor Ed Flynn. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Bach, and thank you again to the superintendent and to her BPS team. Superintendent, I just have one question. I know we're providing tremendous outreach and support to students during this difficult period and as well as for the upcoming school year. Could you talk about some of the services or programs or outreach and support we're also able to provide to our teachers? It's also going to be a challenging time for them and their families, maybe balancing their duties as a teacher, but also balancing their duties as a parent or taking their kids to a medical appointment as well. Those types of issues. But what type of are we thinking outside of the box, like Nate said, in terms of what we could do to make sure that our teachers are also successful in being helped during this challenging time as well?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I just want to, you know, do another shout out to our teachers who are doing an amazing, amazing job of reaching out. I know in the earlier hearing, I talked a little bit of not only are they providing the remote learning experience, but also the, you know, wraparound services and support and problem solving for families too, to help students and their families get what they need. You know, teachers get their largest support from their school leaders. We built the MOU so that teachers could work with input into their schedules, knowing that teachers had their own families and circumstances that they were also dealing with at home. I can't even imagine trying to teach back when I was a single mom and raising my son and then having to teach middle schoolers remotely by a computer, not having any computer experience myself at that time. I think it would have been extremely challenging to do so. Principals have been adjusting and working with teachers on their schedules. Some teachers are actually working on weekends to be able to adjust those schedules or doing things in the evenings as well. So I think that's one way we're helping to support for the unique needs of our teachers as well. We do have employee assistance programs if teachers are having difficulty with mental health support. So we are also providing that service to teachers. They also can take their leave if they need to take their leave. We've been reminding them of that if they do need to take leave, we are paying our per diem subs. So if they need time, they should take the time, and we can get a substitute teacher like we would do during a regular school year. Also, I think just teachers want to feel heard. They want to feel valued. And that goes a long way to them feeling appreciated and in doing this work, and because they are human like everybody else. And I think and this is why I do the focus groups and why I make myself available. I respond to teachers immediately when they send me emails and texts, because I think they just want to feel heard. And that goes a long way with their mental health and supporting them. So those are some ways. And then of course, we're doing the other things with providing professional development for our teachers, and then having them share their best practices with each other. That gives teachers energy. I always say teachers learn best from other teachers. And if they have the opportunity to share with each other and they get joy from that, I think that's great. You'll see these wonderful little video clips that are going around where they're staying connected with each other. They're holding up signs and editing these videos of saying, we miss you. Kids have done wonderful things with driving by their teachers' houses. I've seen a couple of videos of that on Teacher Appreciation Day, where they did really special events for their teachers too. So I think those are things that build a sense of community, a sense of pride, and a sense of family that keep sustaining us all.
Well, thank you, Superintendent. And I know you've only been here a short period of time, but I think you've been doing an excellent job bringing great leadership to the public schools and the children and the teachers. So just want to say thank you for being very responsive as well to the City Council. Thank you, Superintendent, and thank you, Councilor Bach.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Councilor Flynn. Next up, I think Councilor Flaherty had to step out. So actually we'll jump to Councilor Braden. Councilor Braden? Okay. Councilor Braden, I'm going to skip you because we're just going to need to keep going. So Kim Janey, Councilor Janey.
How are you? Can you hear me?
Very great. And that's an adorable photo.
Aw, thank you. I think I was about 2 years old there on my little play telephone. I just wanted to follow up some of the questions that I had before. Thank you, Superintendent. You gave very thorough, helpful answers, but had just a few follow-ups. So we were talking about the different online platforms. So you were mentioning, I think, as the chime was going off, you were mentioning like if a child logs on to Wikipedia or something for an assignment, that there is an online Clever, is that what it's called? Clever is capturing that?
Yes, the teacher has to put that website into the Clever application, and then we can capture whether they're on that. If they do an assignment, they can post their assignments to the Google Classroom.
Yeah.
Or a bulletin or chats or things like that. And we could capture that too if they're signed in their Google account.
So I'm hearing some feedback from teachers that the more steps that they give for a young person, the less likelihood of like logging on. So if you have to log into this and then you log into that and then you log into this, that you're going to lose folks. Is that, so help me, I just don't know what the process is. And I certainly would share that concern. Like, I don't want to be overcomplicating things. Obviously, I think it is very important that we understand, which students are, logging on to these different sites and completing their lessons and who isn't, so that we can support those who aren't. But could you just speak to the process a little more?
As long as they log in with their BPS email, we can pretty much capture just about everything. But there are some applications, like if they send them to a different application and we don't have that in there, and so then we can't get them, we can't see that in our database.
I'm sorry, I just know that our chairwoman is very good at timekeeping, and so I certainly don't mean to cut you off. I just hope to get in a few more questions. I wonder,
So is there a suggested preferred platform? Are we asking people to do the Google Classroom versus the Zoom versus the this versus the that? Or is there still like, are teachers choosing what works best for them and their students? How does it all work? Help me understand that.
Well, it's all of that, right? So what we're trying to do with our data system now, which we've had for just a few weeks, is capture all of that. We do have a new data system that's going to be matched with it. I think it's called InV or InVine or InVin. It's some new system that's going to be able to capture our Zoom and some of the other applications that we haven't been able to capture before. So we're feeling that that's promising, and then that would be invisible to the user, so that then they don't have to do all these other clicks. We can actually just capture it.
And that would be the user being the student and the educator, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
not extra work for either?
Yes, and so this is a new product that we've just gotten. So we're doing some data integrity trials with that now, and some quality cleanup around that, so that we can use that and add that to our other systems and have a better picture of when students are online, or when they're participating by phone or other Zoom and that sort of thing.
And one question I had in the earlier round that I don't think we got to was how teachers are being supported in their efforts to collaborate, to do shared planning for professional development. And I wonder about that, just how teachers have to do that as part of, that's what they, from my conversations with teachers, that is very helpful to them. And that's something that would be good to continue. But in addition to that, I think just another question about how we support our educators in using these various platforms, because I would anticipate, like many of us who have been thrown into a new, it's one thing where, you're being asked to do your work in a totally different way. And I know that looks different for some of our bargaining units, but, are we able to then keep up with the different platforms and how we're supporting folks on the technology side? And I'm, looking at the diversity of age in terms of our educators, and just different experience with technology. And our digital divide isn't something that goes away when people graduate and go to college. Some of our households, adults, working families who are professionals who, maybe are not used to doing video conferencing and raising blue hands and all of this other stuff. So how are we supporting educators on both fronts?
Well, we're doing it in both formal and informal ways. So the very formal way is that our academic office has curated lessons on our learning resource page that actually a lot of other districts are using, and we're getting national attention around our multilingual library, which is phenomenal. So teachers can go to that if they're not as comfortable and if they have emerging skills. We also required 5 hours of professional development around remote learning, so that they knew how to do the Google Classroom and the Clever, know how to use Zoom and other tools, so they get those. And then there are the informal ways where school leaders are working with their staffs to share best practice, and they're sharing these across classrooms, across platforms. They're collaborating in ways that they've really not done to this extent before, because teachers want to be successful in this environment. And so they're asking a lot more questions of each other and sharing more freely with one another. And we've been able to capture some of that in our own capture around data classrooms. For instance, all of the school leaders shared their master schedules, so all school leaders could see every other school leader's master schedule. And we're just doing a lot more of that sharing organically, and then more formally in our new Link Learning platform.
And then I wonder, I think this is great. The more we can support our educators, the more we can support our young people, the more we can support our families. I'm thinking about that more and more people are kind of going back to work, meaning maybe perhaps leaving the home and going to a physical space, even while our students remain at home. And I obviously we can't be over intrusive in terms of trying to understand what's going on in every single household, but if there's ways to reach out and support families who now may have fewer adults at home because more of them are being asked to go back to work. I want to flag something for us to be worried about and to think about as we move forward. And obviously that goes beyond you, superintendent. But that's something that we all have to be thinking about, how we support our young people. I want to say thank you again to you and your team, particularly concerned about, for this hearing, again, lifting up the English language learners and our students with disabilities as we move forward around loosening some of these restrictions, and how we continue to try to offer more and more services and supports to those students while being safe, obviously, that we talked about in the first round. So any plans moving forward or follow-up discussions, very interested in that. And I think if you have a brief response, thank you, but I think I see the gavel, and that would be it for me. Thank you so much, Superintendent. Thank you to you.
Well, I thank you for your support in that. And those are all considerations that we're thinking about, especially supporting the child and the family. Typically, you know, we engage with families, but it's more tangentially in individual students. But we know that we have to do a lot more in this particular crisis to support our families as we support our students in delivering not only the education, but also just creating routines in the classroom, in the home, and setting them up for success.
Great. Thanks so Thanks so much, President Janey and Superintendent. Okay, next up is Councillor Asabi George, and then it'll be Councillor Mejia. Councillor Asabi George.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. I'm curious through this time and what the plans are going forward to engage some of our nonprofit partners that are really important partners to the work that happens in our schools, especially as they on their own have some pretty deep and unique relationships with our students. And when we think about students who are either disengaged or not fully engaged in school from home, they may have different sort of insight into how do we engage these kids in their schoolwork. So basically, how are we engaging our nonprofit partners today? How do we plan on utilizing them over the summer? And what does a potentially new school year look like in partnership with them?
That's such a good question, Councillor George. We have so many partners who are doing such amazing work, from BAM, Sociedad Latina, the Y has been an incredible partner. Tenacity. I can name so many partners that we have, typically City Year, others who, are still engaging with our youth and keeping them engaged and connecting and checking in with them. It's really quite inspiring to see the work of our community-based organizations and the work that they're doing during this time. We just really couldn't have done it without them in terms of our students' mental health and connectedness. So it's been quite inspiring.
Great, thank you. So I do hope that they are engaged in sort of the efforts going forward and have a seat at the table in some of that planning.
And we've also kept all of our contracts with them during this time as well. So, not only are they compelled to do it because we're still contracting with them to do it, but they've also been terrific partners just because it's the right thing to do.
Are we just considering sometimes a sensitive communication that happens between a young person and an adult, whether it be a teacher or a program, an outside program working with our kid? Are we ensuring some of the protections around privacy, thinking about the technology piece in particular when these programs are interfacing with our kids? I guess for that matter, are we making sure that that's also being applied when our teachers are teaching with our students?
Yeah, it's still a requirement for all of our partners to have
I guess my question is more around the technology and the use of the internet. There is, I guess, and now that I'm saying it out loud, I'm realizing there's this false sense of security when things are happening in a classroom or in a school building. There is a sense of security, whether it's real or not real. But now when technology is used at home, or if you look at some of my colleagues on their back porches, that student information and communication may be more at risk of sabotage or encroachment. I don't know what the right word would be.
Yeah, so we are absolutely mindful of that, and we've issued guidance to our partners around that out of our family engagement and advancement office. So partners have agreements with us and MOUs with us, and they've been issued guidance around how to interact on online learning.
Great, thank you. And for me, as a former teacher, as a parent, as committee's chair on education, the council's committee on education, it's tremendously important to me that we are doing all we can to make sure that students can return to school in September. We think about all of the challenges that we faced and the question and uncertainty we faced in March when making the determination to close schools. We knew that kids wouldn't have access to food and nutrition. We knew that there were some significant safety concerns. We knew that we may lose some kids and kids will fall through the cracks because we're not able to communicate with them. We know about the technology divide. We know about the challenges that many of our families have with accessing the content. My kids are now doing high school math. It is complex for me. It's complex for my husband, who's an engineer, to get, to sort of wrap our heads around the new math and the new content and the new style of teaching and curriculum design. And, granted, this needs to be a public health, there needs to be a public health response to this pandemic and to this crisis, but it's so important to me that we do all that we can to make sure that kids can return to school safely in September, if not into some sort of summer programming before, because the learning loss will be addressed if we can get kids into our classroom. The technology divide, to some degree, at least during the school day, can be addressed if we get kids back into our classroom. Access to food, at least during the day, can be addressed if we can get kids back into our classroom. It's so important that we're making the steps. And of course, planning, should there be a change, should there be a surge, should there be a second spike, to respond to that with the lessons we've learned over the last few months. But it is so important that we get kids back into the classroom in September.
Well, we knew, Counselor, before COVID that school is the safest place for some of our kids, right? And we know that they provide a second home and a second family for children, and there's so much more to going to school than just learning. And so, many times it's where they get love, they get food, they get community, they get connection, they have friends. It's so fun when you and heartbreaking at the same time when you see these kids in the video saying, oh, I got to see my friends, again. And so it's just so important for them to have that as children for their own child development. I really worry about our children and this generation if we can't get back to school soon. And so, balanced off of Councilor Arroyo's concerns around safety. And that's why I said it's my job, whether it's 5 kids in a classroom, whether it's 10 kids in a classroom, whatever it is, at the earliest convenience that that we have, and the earliest way of safe to be able to provide these services to our special ed kids, provide these services to all of our kids. I want to be able to do that, but I have to be able to guarantee their safety first. And then that means that as superintendent, I need to find a way for that to safely happen.
Right.
As soon as possible.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And, just recognize all the needs that our kids have. It. Anyone who's spent a minute in a classroom recognizes the needs of our students across the district. And oftentimes those needs are associated with poverty, with lack of access to mental health and physical health, and sort of the challenges of the environment around them. And school and the classroom is a tremendous equalizer. Especially when those classrooms across the district are offering high quality services in addition to the academics, the athletics, the art, the enrichment, the social and emotional support. So I look forward to obviously a continued conversation over the coming weeks and months, and hopeful for a safe and speedy return to school. Thank you, Dr. Cassellius and everyone in your team.
Thank you so much, Councillor Sabi George. Next up is Councillor Mejia, and then it will be, sorry, I lost my list. And then it'll be Councillor O'Malley. Councillor Mejia.
Yes, thank you for round 2. Here we go. I am just kind of building off a little bit of Councillor Sabi George's questions in regards to just the transition for a lot of our students. I'm just really curious about the mental and emotional well-being. It seems like we just went into direct academics, which is important, but I'm just wondering what if any opportunities exist as we start thinking about remote learning beyond in the summer, and then as we start getting ready for the fall, is what opportunities exist to be a little bit more mindful about the social and emotional and mental well-being of students. This isolation issue, the issues of just the trauma of being at home, oftentimes in homes that you're not well loved or cared for. All of those things have bubbled up to the top for a lot of students. And so I'm just curious what this looks like going back. I wouldn't say going back to normal, but you know.
Yeah. So I don't think there's ever going back to the normal. One, I think we've learned a lot in remote learning that actually can help us meet the needs of our students and more personalize the learning to some of our students, and also help us stay better connected with our parents and our community. So those lessons we'll take in to create better equity. I know that we're stronger for that. As for the social emotional health and health and reconnecting with our students, we have to be really mindful of what those first 2 weeks of school look like when we come back. There'll be a lot of new routines to learn. If we're social distancing, and we will be social distancing, how do we create still joyful learning environments for children and for adults, because happy adults make for happy children. And I think there will be some grieving process with all the trauma that's happening in terms of how do we reestablish our sense of community in the classroom. So, I mean, I have this idea that we go back to school and we have some reconnection with the teachers that were previous before we move on to the new teacher, so that there's familiar faces for the children and familiar relationships that they can depend on. So I think that that's just really, really important to this reconnectedness and the sense of and the building of community, and to deal with the trauma really intentionally. And so we'll be working with Andrea Amador's team to be able to really look at what kind of support systems do we need to have for staff and for children during the day, because I can imagine a lot of tears and a lot of reconnecting and a lot of community building. So that's part of it. And then just the environment itself. I mean, if desks are 6 feet apart, or if children don't have the same kind of manipulatives, or if they can't go out for recess, you know, what are we going to do to still have joyful spaces? Because otherwise it's too sanitized, and it becomes much more difficult to create that sense of community and that sense of normal for children.
Thank you for that. So just 2 quick questions additional that I'd just like to get in. Following up on Councilor Sabi George's question, can you go into detail on the BPS plans in the event for a second wave of this pandemic? What's that going to look like?
So we are working on those contingency plans right now. If there is a second wave, obviously, if it is serious enough, it would involve closures. It could involve closure of 1, 2, or multiple schools. And so I think that those interruptions are being planned for now. And what would that look like? We don't have all of the answers for that yet, but because it is evolving in terms of the CDC guidance. And so once we do have that, we will for sure communicate that more broadly.
So what I'm concerned about is that often the schools that are usually overcrowded are in low-income communities. And so, you know, when we start thinking about the plan to go back, I know that some of these schools already bear the brunt of overcrowdedness. And so just really something to...
Yeah, so we won't have overcrowdedness. We will have very strict guidance about how many students can be in each classroom, and we will have strict guidance on transitioning in terms of, you know, typically, you know, the bell rings and all the kids go out in the hallway and everybody's, you know, there will be none of that. I mean, we will have to think about how kids transition, or if they do even transition, and maybe they're in family groups. So we're really thinking about all of that and how we schedule and how we group our students to the highest safety for them.
And one last question before I get the boot here is, are there any plans to release a survey similar to the one released in April for summer learning programming, or will the survey that was released in April be operationalized and updated for the summer?
So the survey is still open and ongoing. And so we are still looking at those results and comparing those results now to how they looked at the beginning when we first launched it. So that survey is still open and ongoing. And we continue to want to survey our families. I anticipate looking prior to summer start at how do we get more and more feedback from our parents in terms of surveying them and understanding this experience and how it's going for them.
Thank you. That is all. Thank you, Chairman Bach.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilor Mejia. Next up, we've got Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so I'm just going to kind of try and pick up where I left off. Since then, you've spoken more about the idea that classrooms might have smaller sizes, school let out and social distancing might have to be enforced in a different way. And I think Chairwoman Bach brought up the financial costs in a real way, which I think I don't have to revisit. But I'm just trying to figure out, from a month ago when you spoke very clearly, in my opinion, on the idea that children just cannot be depended on to social distance, what in your thinking has changed? Not the CDC saying, you know, that they should, because I think we all agree that they should, but what in your opinion has changed is their ability to actually do that? I think we have such a hard time keeping adults off of Carson Beach, never mind, you know, high schoolers from seeing their friends and wanting to go sit with them, or from children wanting to hug people. And then on top of that, I think a separate part of that is, I had asked you as a follow-up, what if we did smaller classroom sizes? And your answer was that you didn't think teachers could manage this even with 10 children. But you brought up a second more relevant point, and that's a quote, it's April 14th. But you said you didn't think that teachers could manage this even with 10 kids. But what you brought up that was equally important to me was that you believe that there would be that it wouldn't be socially and emotionally correct for our children, that there would be a psychological cost to socially distancing in schools. And so if you could just tell me what in the last, I guess, 8 weeks, I think that's 8 weeks, has changed that, or 6 weeks rather, has changed to tell you that children could handle this now, that it wouldn't be socially and emotionally incorrect for our children to have to do this in schools. I'm having a hard time understanding how you reversed on that position, or if you have reversed on that position. Do you not believe today, like you did then, that children can't be dependent upon to socially distance?
Yeah, I don't know that children can be depended on to do it. That means why the adults are going to have to set up the routines for children to be able to do that. If I asked in a second grade class to get into a line, they could get into a line and they would not socially distance. But if I asked them to get in a line and I have markers on the floor that are all different colors, and maybe there's some frogs and some, little lily pads, and I ask them to get on those, that's kind of a more fun activity for them. And then they do comply. So it's about the adults and the routines and being able to work with them. Just the overwhelming thought of, on April 14th of doing this, I hadn't really thought through all of the different pieces of getting that together. I have not shifted my thinking on the social emotional burden that I think this is going to have a cost on our children, whether it's at home or whether it's in the classroom. But I do feel that we have to adjust for that, because the cumulative effects, and I don't think I had accounted for that on April 14th. I mean, I was still thinking this is short term. I wasn't thinking that this is actually going to be with us for a very long time, given the new science that is available and the learning that I have. And I think that the cumulative effects of not opening may outweigh the effects of, opening. So, it's really a tough decision. And I don't know that there are any wins in it, because we can't go back to how it was normal until we actually do have a vaccine. We are going to have to continue to social distance. And we are, as adults, going to have to figure this out together. But if we aren't able to check all those boxes, like I said before, and I'm not confident that we have the routines in place to keep our children safe, then we just won't be able to open.
So I just, because we have such limited time, and I'd like to prevent myself from having to need 3 rounds. It's just, even on that date, right, which was a month ago, the question was about reopening in the fall. And your suggestion at the time, you said your best advice that you did not believe politically other people would follow, but that your advice was for child psychology purposes, remote learning was probably more adequate. And I think people are allowed to change their minds and to have their opinions, but I was just trying to figure out how anything has changed since then to actually lead to that kind of a drastic change in opinion in 6 weeks. And the reason why this is so important for me is I think if I asked, and that's why I'm not going to waste any time asking, how many children are allowed to get sick or to have any kind of complications, or our grandparents or parents are allowed to get sick and to have any complications, so that we can consider that an acceptable loss to reopen schools so that kids can get all the other things that school brings them. And I think the answer would be zero. I do, that's why I'm not asking. And so when we talk about all the ways that we would have to make this work to actually get kids back in school in September, I don't see a roadmap to that. I'll give you an example. I had to take my puppy to the vet, and I couldn't even get in the door because they wanted to make sure that I hadn't been tested within the last 7 days, that I wasn't waiting for test results. And I had to leave the puppy at the door for them to get the puppy to bring him into the veterinarian's clinic. We're in a situation where 70% of people of color make up essential workers, where they have higher mortality rates, where we are impacted in more ways than one, and where those kids belong to those parents and those grandparents, and they're coming to schools and they're interacting. And we don't have the ability to ask students every day, is somebody in your family getting tested for COVID-19 and awaiting results? And if the answer was yes, what's the answer to that? Do we tell them to stay home? Do we wait until the results come in before we tell them to stay home? What are all these different roadmaps for things that we're allowed to do, not just for the kids in our schools, but the parents in the homes that they're going back to? What do we do when they're sick at school? Is that a red flag? So there's a number of different issues with asymptomatic issues, with the reality that their family members are both more at risk for COVID-19 and are more at risk for death with COVID-19. And so for me, it's like, I get we're losing a number of different things, and there's a number of students who just can't learn the way that we're trying to do it. But if we're talking about trying to think through multiple scenarios for how we reopen, the reality is, I don't think we're going to be in a position in September, and I would be hard pressed to believe we'll be in a position in September where we can guarantee the health and safety of every student going back to school. I just don't think that's a guarantee anybody here would sign a contract on and say that's a thing. And so if that's the case, why wouldn't we dedicate every minute of every day to trying to make remote learning work better and work in a way that we want it to, rather than trying to reopen and spending resources and dedicated resources to something that's just not going to guarantee, which I believe is what you said, it's the health and safety of every child is what would determine whether or not schools reopen. I'm looking at you now and I can't understand how we would get there. I don't see a world in which that's possible in the midst of a pandemic. And so as we sit here and we talk about how we allocate resources, doesn't it make more sense to allocate our resources, our time, all of the stressed brain power and strained brain power that we have at BPS that is really under the gun and trying to make so many different things work? Wouldn't it make more sense to focus on one plan for the short term, which would be remote learning for that first semester, and then revisit, as we're doing that, the idea of reopening schools post-January? Wouldn't that make more sense?
I wish it was that simple, Counselor, but it's just not. We are throwing everything that we have at making remote learning work, and we're learning every week and getting better and stronger at it, and our teachers are adapting to the remote learning experience. Certainly it will take some time to get perfect at it, but they are doing everything that they can to get good at the remote learning. It will be part of any reopening plan, but we will have to reopen at some point. And so, whether that's now, whether either that's in the fall, whether that's, sometime in the winter time, whatever that timeline is, we will have a clear framework on how we're going to do it. We'll be able to answer all of your questions and build that public confidence, because if we aren't able to do that, parents simply will not send their children to school. And so it is incumbent upon us as the adults to be able to have those plans so well laid out, so well thought out in terms of temperature checks or PPE availability, or how we keep children socially distanced, and how we isolate if a child is sick, and how the nurse gets them back home safely. or if they have a family member, or if we close. So we have all of those contingencies as part of our decision matrix ready and available now, and the public will be able to see that transparently once we have those plans finalized, so that we can build the public confidence and send our children back to school, as well as know that it is the morally and right thing to do at that moment and at that time. And if we do it and we are seeing that we are unsuccessful, then we will make swift action and shift our decision at that time.
Thank you. And so I see the gavel and I heard the wind chime. So I think I'm going to save the rest of my questions for the hearing that I and Councilor Sabi George are co-sponsoring. And I know we're coming at this from two different angles. So I'll save it for then. Thank you for the answers. I think there's a lot of ground to cover on that front, which is probably less related to the budget. But I'll cede this time, and thank you for answering those questions. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, Chairwoman Bach, for how much I have to make you hold that gavel. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilor Arroyo. I think now it's going to come to me, and then I'm again not planning on a full round of third round of questions. So people who have a burning question before we conclude the hearing should raise their blue hand. Let me set myself a timer. Superintendent, I'm certainly glad to hear you all are working on the, I know our teachers are working on the remote learning platform, and it does seem as though, even looking at the CDC guidelines around, making it easier, just trying to super encourage kids to stay home and miss school if they're feeling sick or someone in their family is, et cetera. Like, we're going to need to have some way for kids who have to be out of school for a sustained period of time to learn, even if we're back in school. So definitely feels important to be investing a lot in the platforms on that front. I feel like we've all looked so far, like we've all looked straight at the fall. And so we've jumped the conversation a little bit of the summer. And I just wanted to ask you and your team, Nate mentioned, freeing up some resources from FY20 to pour into the summer school efforts at the beginning of FY21. I guess I'm really wondering exactly what that's going to look like from you guys mentioned in your slide, sort of expanding summer offerings, but obviously there's also this virtual necessity for many of them. So could you speak a little bit more to the plan on that front?
Yeah, I was just,
go
sorry.
ahead, Nate.
Well, I was just going to say all of the summer learning this summer will be remote. We're combining multiple programs and looking across them to make sure we're leveraging and matching students with the most appropriate program that meets their educational needs. And then we're also making sure that we're expanding access to be able to serve more students, because we know that there are more students who need either credit recovery or just supplemental support over this summer. And so part of that is just looking across, working with schools to identify kids and make sure we have resources available.
And sorry, Superintendent, if you wanted, or just how many students are we expecting to serve, and how many would we have served in a typical summer?
So typically we serve around 7,000 students in a summer school. We think we could serve double that, depending on which session we're talking about. Remember, I talked about kind of the three phases or the three opportunities for engaging students, one being kind of more of our traditional summer school, but done remotely. The second being where we have continuity of learning plans based off of our students that we are serving now in the tier 2 and tier 3 interventions. And then the third is kind of this thinking around a boot camp before we go back to school, whether that's fully remote or whether that is some sort of hybrid for students who we think have been either further behind or disengaged in their learning, or who need to graduate still from high school. And so those are kind of the three buckets that we're looking at. And then of course there's the traditional opportunities with Boston After School and Beyond. And if there's any opportunity at all this summer to do smaller groups of students who could participate in some enrichment activities, if that's even possible.
Mm-hmm. And have we thought at all about, accompanying, I don't know, it feels to me like accompanying some kind of totally virtual thing for the summer with young people, you either need like a tactile dimension where you're dropping off with them, the supplies to do some kind of like activity, or you're creating some kind of incentive structure or competition. I just think about like, every kid who's ever been assigned to, watch 20 hours of something over the summer and how nobody does it, right? Like, I mean, there's a real challenge, we know, in sort of more traditional online learning applications to getting people to log in, especially in summertime. So is the team thinking about that piece, the tactile piece, and what the cost implications of that could be?
Yeah, we actually have a smaller project that we're doing with our early learning team around kits that we want to have for 700 of our UPK students. And so we've been working to look at what does that look like for week 1 learning kits, week 2 learning kits for our youngest learners. And then we've had increasingly parents talking with us and requesting, as well as teachers who teach our younger students around what would that look like in reopening to give students kind of remote learning kits, dry erase boards, markers, crayons, other manipulatives and things that kids would use. And even as we go back to our own classrooms, CDC guidelines is not sharing materials, and so much of what we learn, actually our entire, kind of school culture is around responsive classroom and around sharing materials with one another. So it's a complete rethinking about the manipulatives and the FOSS kits and science activities and all of that would require us to think differently about materials and content, and that actually will, I think, have a significant budget impact. I think the kits were for the early learning, correct me if I'm wrong, Nate, I think they were about $200 a piece for those early learning kits.
I actually don't have that number in front of me.
I think it was it, because I remember the overall cost was somewhere like $150,000 or something for those kits. And that's a small little pilot to see, putting those kits together, distributing them, how would we distribute them safely, and get those out. And I think that's, the challenge with the kind of situation we're into. We have the good intent and the meaning to do it because we know it's important to students learning. And we just recently also worked with partners to distribute 4,000 art kits at our food distribution sites across the city. And so we're learning from those types of projects, and how do we develop remote learning in a way that's not just screen-based, but is also project-based. And so those are as we learn and grow, and we will get better at it.
Yeah, I guess I think, yeah, it's going to be a lot of clay, a lot of pipe cleaners, a lot of, like watercolors, all kinds of things. And sitting in a ways and means capacity, I'm concerned about the question of how we provide those resources and how we make space for them in the budget, because it just seems like we've been talking a lot about equity and the difference in people's homes. And we focused a lot on the fact that people have differential access to and facility with technology. But
I think it's important to know that we provided that in school already. So now it's more of a distribution and how do you get it out, more so than a securing of the resources and of the materials, because we did provide those for our students. But if you're not able to share, crayons, for instance, it's a bit of a different expense if you're going to have individual units of crayons rather than everybody sharing the same box of crayons, or 2 kids are sharing the same box of crayons.
Right. But I guess the good thing about that is that at least it means if we know we have to acquire a whole bunch of individual boxes of crayons, we could acquire them. And then if we're back in classrooms, great. And if we suddenly if those have to be part of a package we're getting out to people because we're continuing remote learning, there is some more ability to like later on branch in our decision making. Yeah, no, that's
it's a huge equity question, right? It goes back to similarly the fundraising question that we had. You have to make sure that when you do that you're getting kids who need it the most get it first, right? I mean, you can't like let those students fall through the cracks. And some schools, schools are preparing all these packets and crayons and getting them out, and then other schools aren't getting it.
Yeah, totally agree. No, and that's what I was going to say is just that, I mean, we talk about resources and we talk about technology, but these non-technology resources, what supplies people have in their homes is a huge differential, and what supplies their families are able to go out and purchase, upon need is just really, really radically different for our students.
And then another equity issue is, just families, how equipped are families to be able to help lead their children through these activities too. And that's another really tough, piece. We just heard Counselor George talking about helping with the math, because we've moved to this new integrated math program that, doesn't have, it's not as traditional in how we learned it, as kids. So, how do you bring the parents up to speed so that they can actually help their children?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I wonder, and have you guys begun the conversations with the volunteer partners who are traditionally in person about the possibility of them having to be remote, but still maybe helping with tutoring our kids and such?
We have, and there's been a number of partners who have been supportive in tutoring. I think this is an area that will branch out. And actually the BSAC, the Student Advisory Council, has talked about peer-to-peer tutoring. And how do they get involved with that as actually employment opportunities this summer to do some peer tutoring for younger students.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, well, that's definitely my time. Let me just see if I have colleagues. Yes, I do. So we'll go back up to the top with a few third round questions, starting with Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Councillor Bach. Thank you, everyone. When Councillor Mejia was talking, he said that some of the alternative high schools have the highest level of absenteeism and just seem to have the greatest challenges. So many of those older high schoolers are working, etc. I'm going back to that model thing again about whether or not it's in terms of making up for lost learning opportunities, if the model of a classroom-based approach in regular school hours is really the best way to deliver education to that particular group. That's my question, or more of a statement.
So sorry, I was trying to get my mute off. What we're doing now is simply not working for all of our students with alternative schools, and many of them have significant challenges confronting them. Either they've been retained multiple years in school, or they have some mental health issues, or they're pregnant or parenting, or they have substance abuse or other concerns. And so how we think about how we serve some of our students who have had some challenges is critical in the work of high school redesign in the future, because we have to serve them better. We've just undergone an entire evaluation of our alternative schools, and I will be bringing forward some recommendations around alternative schools in the future, and how we integrate those students into their learning better and provide more meaningful and relevant interventions and learning supports for them in the future.
Just out of interest, I'm learning more every day about our school district. How many alternative high schools or alternative learning situations do we have?
The exact number I do not have, but we will absolutely get that for you. Somebody may have that for me. And I know we have, I think, 32 high schools. And I think the alternatives number is somewhere around 11 or 12, but
there's a blend of programs and actual diploma granting schools. So Boston Collaborative High School is the diploma granting agent, the group that covers a number of our alternative programs that the superintendent had mentioned, including ABCD University, Ostakai High, just to name a few of the different programs. And then we have alternative schools for, depending on how you sort of group the categories. There's Boston Day and Evening Academy, Greater Eggleston. There's Boston Adult Technical Academy. We, of course, have the adult program, which is separate from Boston Adult Technical Academy. So there's a lot of different offerings that we have in Boston, and part of the work is to sort of figure out how they can complement each other. and how we might integrate them better into our traditional high schools as well. So programs like Diplomas Plus, which has been integrated within Charlestown High School in the past. And so thinking about that. So it's a blended model. That's why there's not sort of like 6 is not the easy answer. It depends on what you want to, how do you categorize a school. Community Academy is another example in Jamaica Plain of another of alternative high schools.
Thank you. Certainly an area of interest of mine, and I feel that if we do a better job with those particular students, it can be totally life-changing for them and for the next generation coming after them. So thank you.
The goal with our high school redesign, counselor, is to go a little earlier, right? To try to use our early warning systems to be able to intervene much earlier with students, and moving to the 7-12 model will allow us to support the students more strategically. I think also with the addition of remote learning and personalization there, and then the addition of our hub school model, and all of those wraparound services at a much earlier age helps us to move upstream, as our chief accountability officer likes to say. Yeah. And we're not then on the back end after children have had a lot of difficulty in school.
Yeah. I really look forward to hearing more about your plans for high schools, and thank you so much for all of your work. Thank you. That's all my questions today. Councillor Bach.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Braden. Next up is Council President Janey, and then it'll be Councillor Asabi-George.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep, hear you fine.
I wanted to thank the team yet again. I didn't really get to focus on the partnership questions, but I've had opportunity to engage with the PIC and BAM. I wonder just about other partnerships and whether or not they're strategically placed in our schools. And for those that are effective in their work, how we can expand, how we can, and maybe increase the budget or just expand to additional partners or replicate what those partners are doing. So for example, BAM is an organization that I'm very impressed with the work that they've been doing. How do we get them into more schools? And I know people mentioned the PIC and others. Thank you. And then that's it for me.
Yeah, I believe we have an increase in this budget for My Brother's Keeper. And I know that they oversee the work of our of BAM and some of those initiatives. We have over 150 partners. We have a partnership fund, and we use our opportunity index for that to provide the funding allocation out. However, I think we can be much more intentional in the handshake and the relationships that we build, and that's part of this asset mapping that we're going to be doing and that Margaret Farmer has designed. And I invite you to go to the new website, and I think you'll see that continuing to grow and expand as we broaden our reach for each of our schools in a more equitable way.
Councillor Janey, you all set?
That was it for me. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. All right, next we're going to Councillor Asabi-George, and then it'll be Councillor Mejia. Councillor Asabi-George.
Thank you again, Madam Chair, and I'll try to be quick. Just want to follow up on that academic boot camp piece for this summer. I think that's great, especially thinking about an opportunity to do some in-person academics. Just want to support that idea, obviously, of course, if it's safe. But speaking of safety and speaking about a hope to return to school in a safe manner, what is the science that we're following? What are the studies that are underway that we're looking towards for information about a safe return to school? There's been some research done internet globally around countries who have had a safe return to school for students. I'm just curious, what is the science? Because and of course we want to rely on the CDC recommendations, but we also know that those recommendations are changing pretty regularly, and that's probably the only thing that we can count on, is that those CDC recommendations are going to change. So I'm curious about the science behind it and the research that we should be following. What are we following?
So I'm certainly not a scientist in this area, so I have to depend on the CDC. I have to depend on Chief Martinez and his discernment, and we partner with our city health commission, you know, their recommendations. So this is a whole team effort in how we make this decision. And of course, they're looking at various indicators right now about testing availability. They're looking at the number of new cases, and you know, to determine whether they think they're seeing a spike or not, and whether we're on the flattening of the curve, so to speak. And then the availability of any kind of vaccine in the future. So those, and broad testing is the best science that's available to us right now, and that's what we're watching, and that's where I'm getting my guidance from.
There is also some just in over the last few days, because I've been paying particular attention to it. And, you know, it's partly my interest to get kids back into the classroom, because I think that is the best place for them to be, of course, if it's safe. And then also my experience as a parent with 4 teenagers home. I'm anxious to get them back into the classroom. But, you know, so over the last few days in particular, there's been some medical research done by mainstream research. I should have brought it with me to reference it more properly. But there's been some studies done, clinical studies done with, albeit smaller groups of kids in school settings across the country, in Australia in particular. And then in Denmark, there's a special on some of the efforts that they're doing. So I think it's important for us as we're looking to the CDC, certainly for that final guidance and those recommendations as the federal agency leading the effort, that there's some of the real science behind this effort should also be referenced and reviewed. And that's something that I think is important for Chief Martinez and Health and Human Services to take a look at as well. I see the gavel. I thank you for your time this afternoon and talking about some really important decisions, no doubt, that you have to make, and you have to do the best that you can. And I don't doubt that you will, with the information that you have when that time comes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Superintendent.
Yep, thank you. We are looking at other international models for opening school and what they're doing for opening school. I don't know if that's based in the science of why they chose to open or not open, but we are looking at some of the procedures, routines, how that's working for them, how it's not working for them, as you heard about what happened in France. So I think that there's some different things, you know, that we are looking at in terms of our overall decision-making around reopening. The science, however, on, you know, just kind of, you know, the disease and the virus and how it's reacting and evolving is something that I have to leave to the experts in that area and the researchers in that area, and Chief Martinez and the state.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Councillor Sabi George. All right, next up, Councillor Mejia.
Yes, we're at the final stretch here. Thank you, Councillor Bach, and Dr. Casilius and your whole entire team. I just wanted to, I'm curious about the Boston Public Health Commission. They have a program called Youth Development Network. They work with high-risk youth in Charlestown, the Burke, Brighton, a number of different schools, Charlestown being one of them. And I asked this question, I'm not sure which hearing, because they're all sounding the same to me at these days. I think it was at the Boston Public Health Commission's hearing about the need to expand that program to help support students who are chronically absent. And as we start thinking about what we have seen on the virtual front, just curious what, if any, opportunities exist to help support students who are in middle school, more as a prevention as opposed to an intervention model. If we can get kids at an earlier age with these targeted support services and case management, students who are chronically absent even in middle school, you know, what, if anything, is being done now as we're looking at COVID-19 and the remote learning? What are we learning about kids who are in middle school? Just curious about that.
Yeah, you know, middle school is a really tough age. I spent a lot of my career as a middle school teacher and administrator. It has a special heart. You either like middle schoolers or you don't, and I love middle schoolers. So it's really hard. This is a hard time for them anyways in their adolescent development, and so we have seen some fall off of our 8th graders and their engagement. So that's concerning to us. And this is why I put in place the student support team process, so that the staff is working to provide the support, and why we built in the family liaisons, as well as social workers and nurses. And those 3 key positions will work with our student support teams in order to support students and do further interventions with them and support systems for them in the community, making sure that they're connected, especially connected to their peers in very positive ways, and connected to an adult who can keep track of them.
And so just curious about the Youth Development Network. Are you familiar with it? It's led through the Boston Public Health.
I have just recently heard about that, as we've been doing work on summer jobs for our kids. I'm still learning about all of the city resources that are available, obviously being new. But that is something I've just recently heard of, and also working with our Office of Neighborhood Services more deliberately too, and how we provide services if those are able to open up in any way.
Yeah, the reason why I bring it up, because it's a program that also employs chronically absent students, and they learn a lot of life skills. So it's not just about a job, but it's really a wraparound, and then they go back into these schools and get additional case management. So I'm hoping that a similar model like that could be expanded into the middle school area. Now that I have heard from some parents who have 8th graders that are struggling right now. So this is why I'm bringing it up to your attention as something to look at more as a prevention as opposed to an intervention. And then the last thing that I'd like to just uplift as we start thinking about going back is that I want to just continue to harp on the mental wellness piece. There are a lot of students right now who are in homes who are not feeling loved or well supported. And because educators are mandated reporters, there's really no one able to do these wellness checks. Like, how can you ask a child if they feel safe at home? Just really curious about how we're paying attention to the needs of students who are at risk for being abused or neglected. Just curious.
I gotta say, during this whole entire time, that is one thing that has weighed very heavily on me in terms of our children's health and safety, their social emotional health, and also abuse or neglect, and that we don't always have an eye into the home now, and we also could see children when they came to us and know if something wasn't right. And then we were mandatory reporters, obviously. And so if we didn't see it, we reported it. And, if we saw something that looked funny to us, then we would report it, or the nurse would report it. And, obviously not having children right there in front of us, it's harder to know what's happening. I know when I grew up, I used to get whoopings, from my dad, and, what happened in the house stayed in the house. Right. And you didn't talk about it. And so I think, this is very concerning to me as we think about the trauma that this whole entire situation is happening. I do want to, Sam DePina sent me a note and said that our supervisors of attendance work right now with the youth development group. So, and they work with that program very closely. I just didn't know how closely they worked with them yet.
I'm a big supporter. I work with that program every summer.
Good. So. Yeah, they're working closely with our supervisors of attendance. At the beginning of the year, there was a big Globe article because this is just such an important piece for me around attendance, and I think that it hooks right into the trauma that students are having. I mean, I think kids don't come to school because either they don't feel welcomed or there's not an environment. The home environment is tough. And so this is a huge concern. They don't just not come to school because they don't want to come to school. There are real reasons why children don't attend school, and we have to do better on following up on our kids and not letting them fall through the cracks.
And I'll say this last thing before I hear the wind chimes, is that I am I am personally committed to this issue as a kid that was chronically absent and dropped out and went back to school. This is near and dear to me. So anything that I can do to help support you in this work, please count on me.
Yeah, me too, Counselor Mejia. My mom was clinically depressed, and my senior year, my second semester, my senior year, I missed 17 days of school taking care of her. So I know personally the impact is to children sometimes when the home life is challenging.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Bach. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia, and thank you, Superintendent. All right, next up is Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm going to save most of my questions for our eventual hearing. But one question I do have is, as you do the phase 1 return, refocus, reality check portion of the timeline, is the input essentially weighted? Are you giving more weight to teachers and educators and parents than you are, say, science guidelines, or are they equally weighted? What is the calculus for all of that different input?
So I don't know that there will be weights. It'll be that every box has to be checked 100%.
So basically, just if you can't 100% say that children will be safe in schools, and then that's it. Like that's the focus.
Yeah, I as superintendent, I think that that's what I need to be able to say, that I'm confident that children can go back to school safely, and that every box has been checked that we see as a box for their safety.
That gives I appreciate
and our
that.
staff both.
I appreciate that. That actually I think is something that though I think I take and most people take for granted, is always good to hear again. And so one of the other questions that I have is, we do have some issues with some of our facilities. For instance, I have a school in the district where the windows don't open. And so we do have some facilities that, if we're revisiting the idea of opening at any time, we're going to have to revisit kind of the ability for air circulation, for all these different things to actually function. And so is there any plan to do a survey specifically of schools, district schools, and what their capabilities are for reopening, and the idea of having windows open, having air circulation, having all these different kinds of things? Is there any plan for a survey for that to happen, or has it happened?
Yes, so we are looking at the school maps right now and blueprints, and we'll be walking our school buildings to be able to look at those, because there could have been modifications since we've had the blueprints. And so Tammy Poost, who is our COVID czar, I call her, has been working with our facilities department, Sam DePina, and Brian McLaughlin and others, as we begin to look at ramping up of all of the capital improvements that we have to do to ensure a safe return.
And just finally, as we talk about an eventual return with safety guidance in effect, which would involve temperature checks and all these different things, that's time consuming. And I remember my days in school, homeroom check-in would take a certain amount of time. How are we factoring in what the impact on learning time is, both for transportation now? So for instance, remote learning, which is not working necessarily the way we would want it to for a number of different people, does take out transportation. It does eliminate sort of the need to do these kind of wellness checks, which take up time. And so from the standpoint of opening up schools again, in a kid's classroom calendar or teacher's classroom calendar, who's going to be responsible for temperature checks for the student body? How is that going to happen in an orderly fashion? What do we think we're actually looking at from a schedule standpoint on that? Are we going to have to stagger schedules to meet these sort of smaller classrooms and smaller student bodies? Are we going to have to do different days? There just seems like a number of different issues there. And I don't know, and I'm not expecting necessarily that you have exact answers, but as you frame that and you think about that, whose responsibility are we believing it should be? Is it the teacher's responsibility to be essentially temperature checking the students, or is it going to be some other entity within the school that's going to do these temperature checks and do all of these different things?
Yeah, so we are working on all of those questions. You have a lot of really great questions, and we don't have yet all of the answers, but we are considering all of these questions that you're asking, because everybody's considering these across the nation. And as I meet with superintendents, I learn every day new questions we need to be asking. So would love to have a list of all of your thoughts that you're thinking through, because it's you're thinking through very deeply. And so any advice or counsel that you would like to give us as well would be helpful. We are holding stakeholder engagement meetings as well to get feedback from teachers and from our nurses and also from the public. So there'll be a lot of input into informing these plans as we move forward, and opportunities and listening sessions so that we can really understand what kind of questions that people have and hear some of the really great creative ideas that I think we'll have from our community.
Yeah, I'd love to participate. And if we can maybe, if you can make an announcement, if you have those dates now so that the public can have them, that'd be great. I would love to participate. Obviously, I went to BPS. I have a GED, but I attended BPS for all of my education, grade 1 through 12. My nieces and nephews continue to go to BPS, and my mom and my sister's a current teacher. My mother was a teacher for 35 years in BPS. And so I'm very aware of the BPS population and what these schools look like and kind of the functional reality of that. I'm only 32, so I'm not that far removed. And so when we talk about schools in general and kind of as we talk about health issues, I think as much as we can do to focus on making the most of what our reality is right now, which is not optimal, moving forward, I just worry that the disruption of starting school again, having to pull children out if there's a second flare up or cancel a school or close a school for a certain period of time is more disruptive than trying to figure out a way to make remote learning work better for everybody in this time frame. And I think we are going to have to get creative. And so I appreciate you answering questions. I'm not trying to put folks on the spot. I'm just trying to get these answers that I know other parents and teachers and constituents are going to have. And as we move forward, I'm happy to take part in that. And that includes sending you, prior to that hearing, sort of an outline of what my thoughts are on this. I'm happy to do that so that you go in fully understanding where my questions are and where my concerns lie. So thank you so much. I see the gavel. Thank you, Chairwoman Bach, for your patience. And I appreciate the fact that you've had some hard questions here today and that you've done your best to answer them as fully as you can. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I very much appreciate your questions and your concern, and I share it. And so invite your partnership as we begin to think about reopening our schools, and love to see you at our stakeholder engagement sessions, which we should be announcing either late this week or early next.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilor Arroyo. Just before I jump to my last set of questions, Nate, I think you said you had an answer to a question from Councilor Edwards earlier.
Yeah, we had gotten the question about vaccinations in terms of the percentage of our students. We have almost 90%, it's about 89% of our students do have full vaccination records on file right now. There's about 5,600 students who, as of May, did not have one of their vaccination records. So it's not that they were completely no records. It was just that, there are multiple vaccinations that they have to have their paperwork in. So I just wanted to, that was a question that was asked a couple of times. So I just wanted to make sure we
Can you say the percent again, Nate?
Yeah, it's nearly 90% of our students have full and complete vaccination records in hand. And there are about 5,500 students, 5,600 students who are missing one of their vaccination records, and then we're working to collect.
So, just a little, right around 10% or less might be missing one or more.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Councilor Sabi George, did you want?
I just wanted to make, I believe I may have chaired or sponsored that hearing on the nursing piece that brought up the vaccinations. And I think that the number that perhaps Councilor Edwards was referencing on the 50% was the digitizing some of that information. So kids had their vaccinations in, but perhaps only about 50% of them were fully documented and online. That may have been that 50% number. That's it, just clarification, perhaps additional clarification, or perhaps making the situation more complicated.
Maybe that might have been improved now with new systems and documentation, I'm not sure.
Right. I'd say that was a few years ago. Thank you,
Yeah.
sorry for that.
No, thank you. Thank you, Councilor Sabi George. It's always valuable. Okay, yeah, I just had a couple more questions, sorry, and then we'll be done. One is just, in the context of contingency planning for all eventualities, I think I've mentioned this before, but it seems as though if we were not able to open in September, I think about an 8th grader going to a new high school. I think about, frankly, any kid switching schools, switching teachers, where the new teacher doesn't know the family, doesn't have the cell phone, doesn't have any contact. And it just feels like a lot of that wraparound stuff that you spoke to, Superintendent, that our teachers are doing becomes incredibly difficult. So I just wonder if we have to be holding open the possibility that even as we talk about social promotion across the board, that if we weren't able to open physically, we might have to carry over classrooms from this year. Thoughts on that?
That was one of the plans that I had proposed to the team, to have students go back to the classrooms that they did prior to closure, simply because it's a familiar adult, it's a familiar schedule. And I think that there can be some healing activities that could be done for the first 2 weeks of school. I think we have to explore that. It would have a significant impact on our transportation, obviously, for those where you have transitionary grades. Where you don't have students transitioning to a different school, then it's not as difficult to do something like that. But if you have 8th graders then going to their 9th grade school, or you have a K-6 and the kids going to a middle school, then that's different. So we are still thinking through what that would look like, and how we could create welcoming environments for children if they do have to transition. So that's part of the planning process.
Mm-hmm. Great. That's good to hear. And then I wonder about the summer program. I mean, are we in a position to, I know we're talking about going from 7 to 14,000, but I almost feel like the impacts of COVID have been so widespread that it almost feels like if any student in BPS wanted to be involved in a summer school activity this summer, I would sort of want us to have that option for them. Is that possible, like for anybody to opt in, or do they have to be in one of our buckets?
No, I do think it's possible. We want to definitely prioritize to the students that need it the most, because that's the equitable thing to do. And we will be identifying and inviting. We can't make summer school mandatory, or I don't think I can make it mandatory in Massachusetts. And so I do think there's a couple of things in terms of our enrollment. Certainly I would love to see every student have continuity of learning plans and get them on grade level by time September comes. I think that we are seeing some exhaustion happen for families. And I think that they may want to just take a break. So as I say, yeah, I want to double it, I'm not sure that I'll have families agree with me that they're not just going to want their kids to go outside and play, for their own mental health. And so, or that they themselves are tired of doing remote learning, especially if we're still going to have to do remote learning in the fall, and they know that they're going to have to get back on and do remote learning. So I think that the struggle here is more about just the family dynamic and, prioritizing family. I think that just speaking from my heart and thinking about as a parent myself, I think I would be tired. And I do think also our teachers are working harder than they've ever worked before. And, it may be hard, may be difficult for us to recruit our teachers too, because they are having their own families right now, and teaching. And typically this is the time that they're off during the summer. So that's why I put in place, this kind of second way, which is saying if teachers can take a handful of students and follow them through the summer rather than just the traditional, that will be one other way to catch students, because the relationship's already there. They know the parents. And I think that parents and teachers would be able to make plans for students around the standards that they need to know to be advanced to the next grade level and do well next year. Mm-hmm. So there's a number of challenges I think that are going to come with summer schooling and summer learning, because it's a continuity of remote learning, and just we're all thrown into this, just quite honestly. And many of our families are experiencing a lot of trauma, and the adults are too. I mean, it's just so unprecedented what we're dealing with here. And the mental exhaustion is real for both our educators and our families and the children themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if there's an opportunity to have some kind of focal point that sort of lets students check into a summer learning opportunity, at the turning point of July into August or something for some students, right? Like if there's a way for us to create a secondary ramp for families who are just not ready to think about that in June, but maybe are there a month later.
That's why I have the boot camp. option. Because I think that if people just get a couple of weeks off to, take a break, of course, summer learning starts right away at July 1. So, but there may be some families that are like, I just need to have a mental break right now and do some family time and then restart a little later in the session.
Yeah. Well, and I also think there's something to be said for like, even just like if, there's opportunities for big, like everybody do the same virtual activity days, or just like, I feel like young people's understandings of their summer are so often punctuated by events rather than being about a daily grind. But there's something interactive that lets them kind of, engage. I think it makes a big difference.
And I think that's where we're really hoping our Boston After School and Beyond partners can help us with the other really enrichment activities that typically, if you go to summer school, you're in summer school all day and you do summer school. But we're thinking there'd be probably a mix of activities that they can do with Boston After School and Beyond that are very creative, either in the remote environment or if there's any chance, later in the summer for any kind of smaller events for students. So we're really leaning heavily on our Boston After School and Beyond partners who have just done a terrific nation-leading model the past several years. And we've been working with them really since the Saturday after closure. I called up Chris Smith and said, we need to think very differently about this summer and how can we start planning? And he's just been working with all of the partners now on a multiple different contingencies for if we're open or not open, and different remote opportunities for students too.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, no, it just feels like we just need a total, we need like a moonshot for our young people for the summer. And you're right, maybe it's hard to write it, but it just feels like we could be set back 5 years on the opportunity gap by this thing. And I just think that's scary. Like, and I know you're feeling the same way. I'm just.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like a moonshot, right? It feels like, we're in the Apollo 13 and we've got to fit that little, square peg into the round box or whatever. So, and our children's lives are depending on it because this is the one chance they get at their education. And so it's weighing heavy on all of us as we try to create the conditions and where they're successful.
Yeah, I guess my final question would just be, and this is sort of back in the context of like what we're doing here. Like, obviously we're approving a top line budget number for the school department. That's really the task for the council in June. And there's just a huge amount of uncertainty about like what you're going to need to be paying for, frankly. And I think the one challenge around that for us is that we aren't talking, we obviously hope that all the pay fors that go above that line item are things we can get reimbursed for from the feds, whether it's through CARE Act, FEMA, or some as yet unpassed thing. We hope that we don't see cuts at the state level after we all fought so strongly collectively to see increases at the state level. But the hazard of employing that optimistic frame is that we're not having a conversation about trade-offs and about like if something's got to give because we've got to spend a ton of money on these, on various expenses, whether we're talking about remote learning or whether we're talking about in person. I guess I just wonder, as your team looks at the options, two things. Does it still feel like, regardless of the set of options that we're going to move forward on, it's fiscally responsible to make the set of hires on July 1st? And then secondly, within that, do you think you're able to, at least in those contractual relationships, think about sufficient flexibility that those hires are well positioned to support what we're going to be doing, regardless of the different ways that school could look in the fall?
Well, yeah, and the answer just simply is yes. One, I don't think we can do this work with less, that's for sure. I think it is going to take more, but we need our federal partners to step up with the HEROES Act that's going through the Senate right now. So any support you all can help getting that through and the pressure we can put on our leaders for that act, that's a big amount of funding for schools. I think it's $100 billion would go to K-12 schools. And then there's $500 billion that would go to states. So hopefully there wouldn't be this Rob Paul to pay Peter type of thing happening between states and city budgets. So really important for us to stay focused on our state and federal policy. Oh, sorry, my puppy's going crazy. And then I think also because this situation has really been focused on equity, this budget. It's already built with family liaisons, with family in mind. It's built with social workers with mental health in mind. It's built with one-to-one technology. It's built with the facility upgrades that we have to do with, it's almost like we knew that it was going to require with this pandemic, these types of investments. And so, we already had a large capital improvement request put forward for bathrooms and for cleaning with the custodians. I mean, every single piece of this budget was built on an equity frame, and it is also built. The only thing I could say is we just need more of it, in terms of the focus.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Madam Superintendent. I think those are all of the council questions, and I just wanted to give you the opportunity, since this is the end of a series of 8 hearings, maybe more, depending on how you count, that we've had on the BPS budget. Just wanted to, we'll obviously be having a public testimony hearing tonight, and we're looking forward to that at 6 o'clock. If you're watching, please feel free to join us and give your testimony. But since this is our last hearing with your team, I just wanted to give you the opportunity if you wanted to say anything at the close.
Well, thank you so much. First, I just want to acknowledge that we lost a member of our BPS family today. Mr. Keith Love from Tech Boston had a courageous fight and battle with cancer. Just recently, we were able to do a parade to show him our love and appreciation before he passed away this past night. And we're just all very saddened by his passing, but very humbled by his incredible service to this community and to the children at Tech Boston and children in Boston altogether. So I just wanted to make that recognition of his life and his legacy in our school district. And then I have just more of a formal statement that I'd like to share just about the overall budget, and just sharing that I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to lead Boston Public Schools, and humbled by the challenge at hand with this pandemic, but honored to be able to do so with our city partners and Mayor Walsh and his leadership. I'm thankful of Mayor Walsh for putting forward a budget that I think is historic and really understands the incredible work that is at hand, and that it can't just be done in 1 year and year-to-year budgets, but really a 3-year budget where we are able to depend on the funding moving forward to do this really deep systemic work around the inequities that exist within our system. This is just my first year here as superintendent, but I've learned a lot from all of you and your very thoughtful questions, and holding us accountable to do better by our kids. And then also from the public, and doing the strategic plan. And what really this budget is reflective is of the thousands of people who gave input into our budget and into our strategic plan. And as we deal with the emergent issues of the pandemic, we also are still trying to move forward with our strategic plan, because we know we will get to the place where we are back in school. And we know that there's a lot of work still yet to do. We've had about 8 meetings with over 24 hours of testimony with you. We've been able to answer hundreds of your questions, both in person here through the Zoom, and then in writing. It's been absolutely remarkable. I'd like to remind the community that we are the birthplace of public education. We will innovate. We will get through this together. And with this budget, we have the opportunity to really be a national model for creating an excellent and equitable opportunity for our kids, where we learn and grow and innovate constantly, regardless of what's thrown our way. I'd like to just thank our teachers, and I'd like to thank all of our staff for the incredible work that they've done, and the incredible work ahead. This isn't a maintenance budget. This is actually an acceleration budget. This is a budget focused on equity and an equitable education for all our students in every one of our schools, every neighborhood. It will touch all of our schools over the next 3 years, and hopefully beyond that, as well as we begin to put in all of the incredible work into it. I've heard the feedback about the budget documents. It is a dense document, but like you said, Madam Chair, we invite people to look in, to comment on this budget, to provide feedback so that we can just continue to do a better job of communicating it to our public, making sure it's plain language and parent friendly and translated into formats that is understandable. But I just want to end with just some of the major wins in this budget. We are investing in a strong foundation for student success in this budget, like by hiring school-based family liaisons, social workers, to meet the social emotional needs of our students, continuing to expand our nurses so that there's a full-time nurse in every single school, increasing the art and music and science and physical education of our children, which will create the joy and help with the mental health of this trauma. So important. We are also investing in teacher skill development through coaching and consistent feedback aligned to high quality curriculum. Implementing professional development with our K-8 literacy initiative to develop stronger reading skills, which we know are the foundational blocks of all further learning for students. Our UPK investments in early childhood, instructional facilitators to help coach our teachers and provide job embedded opportunities for them. Our teacher leader model around our telescope network, dual language and bilingual and CSLP, culturally responsive focus that we will have. And then ensuring all K-12 classrooms have a full-time professional in them. And then just finally, we are investing in student learning with high quality learning materials and resources in this budget by expanding the access to technology. Now, we didn't know that we would be in a pandemic and be doing remote learning, but we did know that children have to have the tools equitably in which to learn and to be able to connect remotely, and to have this opportunity would be great. To be able to provide consistent high quality literacy materials and opportunities and access to our students. And then being able to have environments in which when they are able to come back that are clean, with the additional of the 25 custodians, and paying particular attention to our joyful learning environments and getting those ready for when children come back. As we've discussed at our hearings, we're adapting to learning every single day during this COVID closure, but we're not slowing down. And with your support in this budget, we'll provide the resources needed to implement our strategic plan and cultivate the amazing potential of every single one of our students. So with that, I'd like to thank Mr. Cooter, Mr. Bloom, the entire finance team, our BPS central office employees who contributed to these hearings and provided the background, answered the questions and data, so that you could be fully informed as we prepare this historic budget for our kids. Thank you to all of you, our school leaders, our teachers, the entire BPS staff, and our many, many partners for their incredible support during this unprecedented time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Caselius. And yes, let me add my thanks to yours, to your whole team. We really appreciate this chance to scrutinize the budget, not just as a council, but on behalf of the public, and to do it in this public forum in a way that kind of opens up this public good, public schooling that the folks we represent care so much about, and that we all care so much about. So I'm sure, there's going to continue to be budget conversations through June, and we're all going to be in partnership figuring out how to meet the challenges of COVID in the months after that. But thank you so much for joining us and spending all this time.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And with that, I'll just again remind the public that at 6 p.m. tonight, we'll be convening a public testimony hearing focused on the BPS budget. And with that, this meeting of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee is now adjourned. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Have a good afternoon. We'll see you at 6.
Bye.